Picture this. It's around 2200 BC. On the banks of the Nile, the pyramids of Giza have already stood for centuries. The pharaoh is considered a living god, absolute ruler over the most stable kingdom on earth. 1,500 miles away in Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire controls the largest territory any human civilization has ever ruled, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Over in the Indus Valley, massive cities with sophisticated drainage systems and standardized weights are thriving, home to tens of thousands of people. These are three completely different civilizations, separated by vast distances, different languages, different gods, different everything. And then, within just a few generations of each other, they all start falling apart. Not slowly over centuries like you'd expect, within what looks in the archaeological record like practically the same moment. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first great superpower, disintegrates. Egypt's old kingdom, which had seemed eternal, splinters into chaos and competing rulers. The great cities of the Indus begin emptying out, their populations scattering into the countryside. Even in the Levant and parts of Anatolia, the archaeological layers from this period tell the same disturbing story: abandonment, disruption, decline. Here's the question that's kept archaeologists and climate scientists arguing with each other for decades. Why would civilizations with nothing to do with each other, thousands of miles apart with no direct contact, all destabilize around the exact same time? Was it something in the sky, something in the soil, something in human nature itself? Now, before you get too comfortable, I want to be upfront with you about something. This isn't going to be one of those videos that gives you a neat, tidy answer wrapped up in a bow. Because honestly, nobody has one. What I'm going to do is walk you through the evidence exactly as it stands. Real data pulled from ice cores, cave formations, ancient riverbeds, and clay tablets. Then we'll look at the competing theories scientists have built from that evidence. And only then, right at the end, will we talk about what's closest to certain. Evidence first, theories second, certainty absolute last, because in a mystery this old, certainty is the one thing nobody can honestly promise you. I also want to clear something up right away. When historians say a civilization collapsed, they rarely mean it vanished off the face of the earth. Sometimes it means political fragmentation. Sometimes it means a massive population decline. Sometimes it just means trade routes went quiet, and cities that once bustled with tens of thousands of people shrank down to a fraction of their former size. Collapse is a messy word, and we're going to unpack exactly what it meant in each place we visit. And we are going to visit a lot of places, Egypt at its most powerful and then at its most fractured. The Akkadian heartland of Mesopotamia, the mysterious kingless cities of the Indus, the drought-stressed settlements of the Levant, the metal trade networks of Anatolia, and the tangled, overlapping timelines of the Aegean. If you're listening to this while falling asleep, or driving to work, or just relaxing tonight, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right there. I love seeing that scroll of cities and time zones. And if you want the easiest way to support this channel, just follow the show on Spotify. Links in the description. Now, let's go back to the world before it all fell apart. Let's start with a word that gets thrown around way too casually. Collapse. You hear it, and your brain probably jumps straight to some Hollywood disaster movie. Cities crumbling, people running through the streets, fire raining from the sky. That's not usually what archaeologists mean when they use the word, and honestly, that mismatch between the popular imagination and the actual evidence is where a lot of the confusion around 2200 BC comes from. So let's slow down and actually define our terms, because this matters more than you'd think. When a historian says the Akkadian Empire collapsed, they're usually talking about something specific: state failure. That means the central government, the bureaucracy, the tax collectors, the guy sitting on the throne claiming to rule everything from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, that whole apparatus stops functioning. The administrative texts stop being written, the provincial governors stop reporting back to the capital. The empire as a political entity ceases to exist. But here's what people miss. State failure does not automatically mean the people disappeared. It doesn't mean the language died. It doesn't mean the pottery styles vanished or the farming techniques were forgotten. Cultures can absolutely survive the death of the states that once ruled them. Families kept farming the same land. Priests kept worshipping the same gods, maybe in slightly different temples. Craftspeople kept making the same tools using knowledge passed down for generations. What collapsed was the top layer, the political scaffolding. What survived underneath was, in many cases, remarkably intact. Then there's a completely different kind of collapse, urban decline. This is when cities specifically shrink or empty out, even if the broader culture and even some form of political organization limps along. You can have a functioning kingdom with far fewer people living in cities and far more scattered across small villages and rural settlements. That's exactly what seems to happen in parts of the Indus Valley during this period. Cities that once held tens of thousands of residents gradually thinning out, populations dispersing into the countryside. Is that collapse? Sort of. But it's a completely different animal than an empire's central government being toppled overnight. So right away you can see the problem. When someone says every empire on Earth collapsed simultaneously around 2200 BC, that sentence is hiding at least 3 or 4 different phenomena inside one dramatic word. Egypt's experience doesn't look like Akkad's experience. And neither of those looks much like what happened in the Indus Valley. Lumping them all together under one banner makes for a great headline. It makes for messier, more honest history. Now let's talk about timing, because this is where things get genuinely tricky, and I want to be straight with you about it, instead of pretending the dates line up like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. When archaeologists say something happened around 2200 BC, that number usually isn't a precise pin on a calendar. It's the midpoint of a range, sometimes a pretty wide range, built from radiocarbon dating, which itself depends on calibration curves that get refined and adjusted as the science improves. A date that confidently sat at 2200 BC 20 years ago might now be presented as somewhere between 2250 and 2150 BC, with real uncertainty on either end. And that uncertainty compounds when you're comparing sites on completely different continents, dated using different methods by different research teams with different amounts of funding and different quality of preserved material. Egypt has an unusually good written record for this period. King lists, inscriptions, administrative documents, so historians can often narrow things down with more confidence. Mesopotamia has cuneiform tablets that give us dates and names and even some economic records. But the Indus Valley civilization left us no deciphered written language at all. Everything we know about their timeline comes from stratigraphy, pottery styles and radiocarbon samples, which naturally gives us fuzzier windows. So when you hear that Akkad and the Old Kingdom and the Indus cities all destabilized within a few generations of each other, understand that a few generations in archaeological terms might mean anywhere from 50 to 200 years, depending on the region and the quality of the evidence. That's still remarkably close together on the scale of human history. It's still genuinely strange and worth investigating. But it's not the same as everyone waking up on the same Tuesday morning to find their world in ruins. This brings us to one of the biggest traps in popular history storytelling, and honestly in a lot of documentaries you've probably watched. The single cause narrative. It's incredibly tempting to find one dramatic villain. A mega-drought, a comet impact, a volcanic winter. One clean explanation that ties every collapse together with a bow. It makes for a satisfying story. It's also almost never how complex historical events actually work. Real societies fail for tangled, overlapping reasons: environmental stress tangled up with political rivalries, tangled up with trade disruptions, tangled up with disease, tangled up with decisions made by specific kings and specific bureaucrats who will never fully understand. The single cause story is seductive because it's simple. The truth, as we're going to see throughout this video, is almost always messier and more interesting. Related trap, the sudden apocalypse framing. The idea that a thriving civilization was humming along perfectly fine and then, practically overnight, catastrophe struck and everything ended. Real collapses, when you look closely at the archaeological layers, tend to unfold over years or decades, sometimes even a century or more. There are warning signs. There are periods of stress and partial recovery before the final unravelling. It's less a single explosion and more a slow-motion unwinding, one that would have been genuinely difficult for the people living through it to fully perceive, because nobody experiences history as a chapter title. They just experience one difficult harvest after another, one bad decision by leadership after another, until eventually, looking back, historians can draw a line and say, here, this is where it fell apart. So, if collapse isn't a single dramatic event, what exactly are archaeologists looking at to even make these claims in the first place? This is worth understanding because it'll come up again and again as we move through each region. They measure settlement size, literally mapping how large a city's footprint was during different periods, and watching that footprint shrink or expand over time. They study burial practices, because how elaborately or carelessly people are buried tells you something about wealth, social organization, and even public health during a given era. They examine texts, when texts exist, administrative records, trade documents, religious inscriptions, looking for gaps, interruptions, changes in tone or content that hint at instability. They track trade goods, tracing whether luxury items, metals, and raw materials from distant regions kept flowing in, or suddenly dried up. And they study fortifications because a sudden boom in defensive walls and military architecture tells you people were worried about something, whether that something was foreign raiders, internal rebellion, or both. Put all of that together across a region, and you start to get a picture, not a perfect one, but a real one, of whether a society was thriving, stagnating, or falling apart. And here's a twist that a lot of collapse narratives conveniently leave out. Sometimes what looks like collapse from the top was actually a form of reorganization that benefited plenty of people lower down the social ladder. When a centralized empire like Akkad's fragments, that's obviously bad news for the king and his court. But for a farmer who used to hand over a huge percentage of his harvest in taxes to a distant capital, the collapse of that central authority might have meant more autonomy, more control over his own land, less exploitation. Some archaeologists have pointed out that certain regions actually show signs of increased local prosperity in the aftermath of these so-called collapses. More diverse local crafts, more regional trade, less concentration of wealth at the very top. Collapse for the elite is not always collapse for everyone. So keep all of this in mind as we move forward. Different kinds of failure. Fuzzy, imprecise timelines. The danger of single dramatic causes. The specific kinds of evidence archaeologists actually rely on. And the uncomfortable truth that collapse sometimes means redistribution rather than annihilation. With all of that as our foundation, here's the real question we should be asking as we travel from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley and beyond. Not simply did these civilizations collapse, but something deeper. What actually changed at the system level, in the climate, in the food supply, in trade, in politics, across all these regions during this same rough window of time? because if we can identify that shared thread, we might get closer than anyone ever has to understanding what really happened around 2200 BC. If you go digging into this period, you're going to run into a very specific phrase almost immediately, the 4.2 Kiloyear event. It sounds technical, almost reassuringly precise, like scientists have nailed down exactly what happened and when. But just like collapse, that little label hides a lot of complexity. Kiloyear just means 1,000 years, so 4.2 Ka is 4,200 years ago measured from the present. On our calendar, that lands you roughly in the neighbourhood of 2200 BC. Not exactly 2200, not the stroke of midnight on New Year's Day. A window, a band of time, where a bunch of different records seem to show something changing in Earth's climate system. So what is this thing supposed to be? In broad strokes, the 4.2 Ka event is the idea that, around that time, the planet went through a phase of drier conditions and climatic instability that lasted maybe a couple of centuries. In some regions that shows up as fewer floods, weaker monsoons, and long multi-decade droughts. In others as cooler temperatures or shifts in when the rain actually arrived. It's not an asteroid impact. It's not a volcano blotted out the sun. It's more like the background settings of the climate system quietly slid into a different mode. We don't know this because someone in 2200 BC wrote, "By the way, the global hydrological cycle is currently reorganizing." We know it from proxies, indirect clues left in the natural world that respond to climate. Some of the best evidence comes from speleothems, those mineral deposits in caves like stalagmites that grow layer by layer over thousands of years. As groundwater drips and hardens, it locks in tiny traces of oxygen and carbon in different isotopic ratios that depend on rainfall amount, source, and temperature. Drill a core through one of these cave pillars, measure those ratios layer by layer, and you get a kind of climate barcode stretching back through time. In several caves from the Middle East to China, something weird happens around that 4.2 Ka mark. The chemistry shifts in a way that usually points to drier conditions or altered monsoon patterns. Then there are lake cores. Picture poking a giant straw down into the mud at the bottom of a lake and sucking up a long cylinder of sediment. Year after year, lakes receive pollen, dust, organic matter, sometimes even annual layers like tree rings. Thicker layers of coarse material might mean sudden floods. More dust and less organic goo can mean lower water levels and drier shores. In parts of Mesopotamia, Syria and the Levant, lake sediments around this period suggest falling water levels and more dust blowing into the basin. In other words, things drying out. Marine sediments tell a related story, but on a broader scale. Dust blown off continents lands in the ocean and settles to the sea floor, where it's preserved in tiny layers. More dust can mean stronger winds over drier land. Off the coast of North Africa and Arabia, some cores show spikes in dust around the time we're interested in, which many researchers interpret as the Sahara and Arabian deserts expanding or intensifying in response to weaker monsoon rains. Add to that land-based dust records, ancient soils, lowest deposits, and even buried dune fields can be dated and compared. In some regions around 4.2 Ka, you see increased dune activity or thick dust layers that fit with the idea of a drying landscape and stronger dust-carrying winds. Put all of this together and you might be tempted to say, okay, global mega-drought, mystery solved. But this is where we need to slow down again and talk about what these proxies can and can't actually tell us. First, they rarely give us simple yes-no answers about rain. A shift in cave isotopes might mean less overall rainfall, sure. It might also mean the same amount of rain falling in a different season, or coming from a different source region, or accompanied by cooler temperatures. A lake that's getting shallower might be evaporating more because it's hotter, not just because there's less water flowing in. Dust in the ocean might reflect changes in wind patterns as much as changes in how dry the land is. Second, proxies are incredibly local and regional. A stalagmite in Oman is telling you about moisture over a fairly specific catchment area. A lake in Syria is recording conditions in its own watershed. Even a marine core integrates dust from a particular swath of coastline and atmosphere. When climate scientists stitch these together into a bigger narrative, they're doing careful, educated interpolation. They're not revealing a single instrument reading labelled Planet Earth Precipitation, 2200 BC. Third, the timing is not perfect. Dating methods on these natural archives come with their own error bars. A cave record might say this shift happened 4,200 years ago, plus or minus 50 years. A lake core might say 4,250 plus or minus 100. Aligning those wiggle lines from different parts of the world is an art as much as a science. You look for patterns that line up, but there's always the possibility that what looks synchronized might actually be offset by a human lifetime or two. Despite all that, a broad pattern does emerge. Around this 4.2 car window, a lot of places that rely on monsoon systems seem to get drier. Rainfall becomes less reliable or shifts away from the growing season. In some higher latitudes, there's evidence for slight cooling. In several regions, proxy records suggest not just a bad year or two, but multi-decade stretches that look stressed. Less water in rivers, lower lakes, more dust. That's the sort of climatic backdrop that, if you're running an empire that depends on predictable harvests and stable irrigation, can absolutely start to hurt. But is this a single global drought bearing down uniformly on every civilization from Peru to the Indus? That's where the debate really heats up. Some researchers argue for a pretty coherent global signal, a reorganization of atmospheric circulation that knocked down monsoons, expanded deserts, and triggered cascading failures in water systems across a huge swath of the Old World. Others look at the same data and see something patchier. Yes, clear drying trends here, ambiguous signals there, maybe even wetter conditions somewhere else. Some areas might have experienced modest stress, others full-blown crisis, and still others barely noticed. And remember, climate is not destiny. A 30-year drought hitting a sparsely populated region with flexible mobile herders is a very different story than the same drought hitting a hyper-centralized irrigation empire that has already pushed its farmland and labour to the limit. The same external shock, totally different internal outcomes. So when you hear the 4.2 Kiloyear event, don't picture a single uniform disaster. Picture a period when the climate system nudged a lot of regions into drier, more volatile conditions, in slightly different ways, at slightly different times, over a couple of centuries. A period that likely produced more bad runs of harvests, more desperate gambles by rulers, more migration pressure at the edges of settled lands. That's the global backdrop we're working with, a world where the odds of environmental stress were ticking upward, but the exact hand each region was dealt varied. In the rest of this video, we're going to take that backdrop and test it, case by case. Did Mesopotamia's Akkadian Empire really crumble under drought? Did Egypt's Old Kingdom fall because the Nile failed? Did the Indus cities empty out as the monsoon shifted? Or are we forcing a climate story onto collapses that had more to do with politics, trade, and human decisions than with rainfall charts? To answer that, we have to leave the global averages behind and dive into the specific landscapes, rivers, and archives of each civilization. That's where the climate story stops being a neat label and turns into something much more complicated. To see what actually failed in Mesopotamia, we need to look at what was working astonishingly well right before it broke, 200 years before our 4.2 car window. Sargon of Akkad pulls off something no one in Mesopotamia had managed before, a genuine territorial empire. Not just one city bullying its neighbours, but a stitched-together system from the Persian Gulf up into northern Syria and maybe beyond. At its core, this thing is a logistics machine. Southern Mesopotamia is basically a giant artificial ecosystem. Cities only exist there because people force the rivers to behave. Canals take water from the Tigris and Euphrates out across the floodplain. Fields soak it up, barley grows, and that grain gets funneled back into the cities through taxation. The Akkadian state plugs itself directly into that system. Farmers don't pay taxes in some abstract sense. They owe measured rations of grain and labour days on canals and fields. Bureaucrats count, seal, and store everything in temple and palace warehouses. From there, the state can redirect food as stipends to soldiers, rations to corvée workers, payoffs to local elites, offerings to the gods. If the canals are the veins of Mesopotamia, the granaries are the heart, and the Akkadian administration is the nervous system trying to coordinate all of it across hundreds of kilometres. But there's a twist. Cities in the alluvium are great at one thing: growing barley. They're terrible at providing almost everything else a Bronze Age elite wants. There's no timber worth talking about. Metal, virtually none. Good building stone? You wish? So the empire is locked into long-distance trade as a kind of life support. From the north and from the mountains, you pull in timber, copper, silver, tin, stone. From the Gulf you reach toward Dilmun, Magan, Meluha, modern Bahrain, Oman, maybe as far as the Indus world for exotic woods, shells and more metals. In return you push out textiles, processed food and surplus grain. Akkad doesn't just skim a bit off the top of this trade. It tries to control it. Garrison towns and colonies sit along river routes and caravan paths. Royal inscriptions brag about subduing the four quarters and making distant kings carry the king of Akkad's yoke. That ideology matters. This isn't just a tax farm with soldiers. It's a story about a universal king chosen by the gods, ruling all lands under heaven. Stelae show the king trampling enemies, receiving weapons from deities, restoring order. The system doesn't just move grain and copper, it manufactures legitimacy. And like any good high-performance system, it's also incredibly exposed. Urban populations in places like Akkad, and Nippur are large and specialized. Most people in the city aren't growing their own food. They live or die on the reliability of grain flows from irrigated hinterlands. Those hinterlands depend on carefully managed canals. Those canals need constant maintenance, dredging, bank repairs, new channels as rivers shift. All of that takes coordinated labour, surplus food to feed workers, and a stable enough political climate that farmers keep showing up when the officials call. Stretch that across an area from southern Iraq up to northern Syria, and you start to see the balancing act. More territory means more resources, more taxpayers, more troops. It also means more fronts to defend, more local governors to monitor, more canals and roads to keep open. We have hints that this system was under stress even before any big climate shift really bites. Later kings in the dynasty complain about rebellions in the far north, or boast about crushing cities that tried to go their own way. There are signs of campaigns against the Subartians and other highland groups, code for the edges are restless. Administrative tablets grow more numerous and complex, with ever more fine-grained categories of land, labour and rations. That can be a sign of sophistication, or of a bureaucracy drowning in its own paperwork, trying to squeeze just a bit more out of fields and people that are already at their limit. Overextension isn't just a military problem, it's administrative and ecological. When you're pushing irrigation to the outer edges of what the land and rivers can sustain, a couple of bad harvests don't just mean tight year. They mean you no longer have the buffer grain to feed garrisons, to repair canals on schedule, to reward allies who are starting to wonder if your god-king has lost his touch. This is where imperial centralization becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, a centralized state can move food from one region to another, deploy troops to protect vulnerable canals, negotiate long-distance trade to cover local shortfalls. On paper, that looks like resilience. On the other hand, when everything feeds into a single political centre and a single ideological story, shocks don't stay local. A bad harvest in one province forces emergency requisitions somewhere else. Soldiers diverted to crush a rebellion can't protect caravans or rebuild dikes. If the royal court is strapped for resources, temples and local elites feel the squeeze, and their willingness to cooperate starts to fray. Legitimacy in this world is tied to success. The king is supposed to keep the canals flowing, the enemies at bay, the gods satisfied. If any one of those pillars starts wobbling, the others get questioned. A failed campaign isn't just a military loss, it's a theological problem. A string of poor harvests isn't just weather, it's evidence that the gods might have withdrawn their favour. By the time we approach that 4.2 car window, the Akkadian Empire looks less like a solid block of power and more like someone running across a tightrope, juggling logistics, ideology and security all at once. So when something finally pushes this system over the edge, what fails first? Do harvest shortfalls undermine the food flows that keep garrisons and workers loyal? Does military overstretch open the door for raids and breakaway regions that choke off trade? Or does a crisis of faith in the king's ability to keep order trigger rebellions that then wreck the irrigation base? Hold on to that question, because as we move into the evidence for drought, dust storms and abandoned cities, we'll have to keep asking, are we looking at food failing, legitimacy cracking, security collapsing, or all three feeding back into each other until even an empire like Akkad couldn't recover? When people talk about the Akkadian collapse, they almost always start with images of empty cities and dust-choked fields. There is some reality behind that picture. If you zoom in on northern Mesopotamia, places like the Habor Plain in what's now northeastern Syria, you see something striking in the archaeological record right around our 4.2 car window. Big, dense settlements that had flourished in the Akkadian and just before Akkadian period start to contract. Some are scaled down to smaller, poorer occupations. Others seem to be abandoned outright. The number of rural sites drops. Irrigation systems that once supported large populations fall silent. On the ground that looks like short occupation layers, fewer luxury goods, cheaper building techniques. In regional surveys it shows up as a thinning pattern, fewer dots on the map where you'd expect more. But it's not uniform. Some areas keep going, others actually grow or reorganize. Down in the southern alluvium, cities don't vanish overnight. They morph, fight, and fail, and revive under new dynasties. Even in the north, pockets of settlement persist. So the first thing to keep in mind, collapse here doesn't mean everything turns to desert in a single generation. It means contraction, relocation, and uneven disruption across a complicated landscape. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't leave behind climate models, but they did leave stories. And the way they remembered this period is intense. Later texts talk about a curse of Akkad, about gods who, angered by imperial arrogance, withdraw their favour. Grain doesn't grow, rivers don't rise, cities are abandoned. People wander, hungry and afraid. Enemies pour in from the mountains and deserts like punishment incarnate. One famous tradition blames Naram, Sin, Sargon's grandson. He allegedly attacks a major temple, enrages the god Enlil, and in response, the heavens shut off the rain. For 7 years barley won't sprout, Pastures dry up and famine stalks the land. To a historian, that's obviously theology, not a weather report. But it's theology with a possible historical kernel. You don't invent a story about a king who destroys his own legitimacy and triggers barren fields, unless people have vivid memories of political disaster paired with food scarcity. The curse texts exaggerate and moralize, but they might be echoing real decades of shortfalls, failed harvests, and disruption. Modern researchers go looking for the physical traces of that disruption. In lake sediments from northern Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions, you see layers with more dust and less organic material, around 4.2 thousand years ago. In some river records there are signs of reduced flow, lower flood levels or changing channels. Soil profiles show increasing salinization and aridification in places that had once supported intensive agriculture. Put in everyday terms, less reliable rain in the north, hotter and drier winds, more frequent dust storms, rivers that don't replenish fields the way they used to. If you're running a marginal farm on the dry edge of the rain-fed zone, you don't need a Sahara-level catastrophe to be in trouble. You just need a string of years where the rains come a little later, or not quite as much, or in the wrong pattern. That's enough to turn a viable village into a losing bet. This is where migration models come in. One way to read the archaeological pattern is as people quietly voting with their feet. As the northern drylands become more precarious, households move south and east, down into the more dependable riverine heartlands. They trade rainfall agriculture for irrigation, hill slopes for canal basins. There are hints of that in material culture. Pottery styles and other northern signatures appear in southern contexts. Population seems to thicken in some riverine zones, just as it thins in the north. But this isn't a gentle, orderly resettlement program. More people crowding into the canal systems puts new pressure on already stretched irrigation works and bureaucracies. Land that used to be comfortably allocated now has too many claimants. Water that used to be sufficient for one village now has to be divided among 2 or 3. Suddenly, conflict isn't just Akkadians versus barbarians. It's neighbour versus neighbour over which branch of a canal gets cleaned first, which field gets priority water in a low-flow year, which city claims control over a strategic headgate. Some scholars frame the period less as pure climate disaster, more as a competition shock. Imagine a sequence: a few bad years in the north push migrants south. Southern administrators, already juggling overextension, start to reassign land, ramp up demands, maybe divert more water to politically important estates. That, in turn, angers local communities, who feel squeezed from both ends by the climate and by the state. In this model, skirmishes over canals and fields can escalate into larger rebellions, especially if highland or steppe groups see an opportunity. Later Assyrian and Babylonian texts are full of worries about canal sabotage and water theft. It doesn't take much imagination to project those concerns back into an era when every cubic metre of water suddenly matters more. And then there's the empty quarter debate. Some researchers argue that the settlement contraction in northern Mesopotamia around 4.2 Ka was so severe that large areas essentially became uninhabited for generations, a kind of regional empty quarter carved out by drought and dust. In this view, climate change wasn't just a stressor. It rendered big swaths of land effectively ungovernable and unusable, slicing the empire's northern support zones out from under it. Others push back hard. They point to continuing small sites, pastoral use, and later resettlement as evidence that the emptiness is partly an illusion of our data. Survey coverage is patchy. Later ploughing and erosion erase traces of small communities. And the very people most likely to move, herders, mobile farmers, are also the hardest to see archaeologically. Under this more cautious reading, we're not looking at a desertified no-man's land, but at a much thinner, more mobile population, reorganizing its strategies in response to tougher conditions. So what do we actually know, and what is still guesswork? We have decent evidence that parts of northern Mesopotamia dried out and dusted up around the time the Akkadian system falters. We see settlement contraction in those very regions that had been important to the empire's grain and manpower base. We have later memories that link divine anger, failed kingship, and barren fields. But the exact timelines are fuzzy. Sediment cores might date a dry phase within a century or two. Archaeological layers might be off by similar margins. That's precise for deep history, but not precise enough to say, in year X the drought hit, and in year Y the empire fell. We also can't assume every region experienced the same thing at the same time. One valley's disaster can be another valley's mild inconvenience. Some cities might have faced catastrophic food shortages, while others, linked into different canals or trade routes, muddled through, and causality is the hardest piece of all. Did climate stress trigger migrations that overloaded the canal system, sparking conflicts that unraveled imperial control? Did political fragmentation and warfare themselves wreck irrigation and trade, making relatively modest climate shifts much deadlier than they needed to be? Or did an already overstretched empire, plagued by internal instability, simply lack the reserves to ride out a perfectly survivable dry spell? The data can support different balances of those factors. What's clear is that by the time dust was settling on some northern tells and famine stories were circulating, the old Akkadian order was gone. In its place emerged new regional powers, new strategies for coping with a less predictable world. And Mesopotamia wasn't alone. While canals clogged and northern plains emptied, or seemed to, another giant of the ancient world, just to the west, was about to discover what low water really meant when your entire civilization depends on a single river. If you had to pick one place in the old world around 2300, 2200 BC that looked like it could ride out anything, it would probably be Egypt. From the outside, the Old Kingdom seems almost boringly stable. Dynasty after dynasty of kings with similar titles, similar art styles, similar tomb layouts, the same basic ideology rolling on for centuries. At the centre of it all is the pharaoh, not just a king, not just a warlord, but a literal pivot point of the universe. In Egyptian thought, the cosmos has two states, order, called Mat, and chaos, called Isfet. Ma'at is truth, justice, balance, the sun rising on schedule and the Nile flooding when it should. Isfet is everything that threatens that. Famine, rebellion, foreigners, even the sun god failing to make it across the sky. The pharaoh's job is not simply to govern, it's to keep Mat in place. He offers to the gods, he performs rituals, he builds and maintains temples, he punishes wrongdoers. He is the human being whose correct behavior is supposed to make the entire cosmic machine run properly. And the single best proof that he's doing his job. The Nile, every year, like clockwork, the river rises in summer, spreads across the floodplain, drops its load of dark silt, then retreats, leaving behind fields primed for grain. Too low, and the harvest fails. Too high, and villages and dikes wash away. Hit the sweet spot, and you get more food than your population strictly needs. For Old Kingdom Egyptians, that sweet spot isn't random weather. It's feedback from the gods about how well the king is upholding Mat. This makes the Nile flood not just a hydrological event, but a political report card. The Egyptian state learned to lean hard into that predictability. Grain was taxed, stored and redistributed on a massive scale. Surpluses flowed into royal granaries and temple estates. Those surpluses didn't just sit there for bad years. They became the fuel for something else that makes the Old Kingdom look invincible. Pyramids. Monument building is where all of these systems intersect. Cosmic order, food surplus, political authority, and raw logistics. When you think pyramid, you might picture piles of slaves whipped to death under the sun. The evidence doesn't really support that. What it suggests instead is highly organised, rotating labour. Peasants aren't farming during the inundation, their fields are under water. The state can call them up for corvée labour, obligatory service, feed them from royal granaries, house them in purpose-built workers' villages, and set them to quarrying stone, hauling blocks, building ramps, baking bread, brewing beer. Meanwhile, specialist crews, stonecutters, scribes, overseers, priests work year-round. Copper for tools comes from Sinai, fine limestone comes from Tura. Granite comes from Aswan timber, resin, and exotic luxuries ride in on trade routes from Lebanon, Syria, Nubia, maybe even farther south. The pyramid isn't just a tomb, it's a machine that integrates the whole country. Every block that goes into a royal monument is proof that the centre can reach into the provinces, mobilise people, skim surplus, and coordinate supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometres. For generations, that system works well enough that the Giza Plateau fills up with stone mountains advertising one message. This order is permanent. But under the surface, there are hairline fractures. Egypt isn't just the king and his pyramids, it's also dozens of provinces up and down the Nile Valley, later called nomes, each with its own local elite, the nomarchs. In the early Old Kingdom, these provincial officials owe almost everything to the king. They are appointed from the centre, moved around, kept somewhat dependent. Over time, though, as the state gets better at taxing and storing grain, provincial posts become more lucrative and more rooted in local families. Tombs from places like Beni Hassan and Asyut start to show nomarchs depicted almost like mini-pharaohs, hunting scenes, offerings, long biographies bragging about how they fed their people during tough times, how they dug canals, how they made the nome flourish. On one level, that's the system working as designed. The king can't be everywhere, so powerful local officials enforce Marat on his behalf. On another level, it's a quiet shift in the balance of power. The resources that once flowed unambiguously toward royal pyramids now also support strong provincial households with their own clients and ambitions. Trade and mining add yet another layer. The Old Kingdom state invests heavily in expeditions to Sinai for copper and turquoise, to the Eastern Desert for gold and hard stone, to Nubia for more gold, ebony, ivory, and captives. They carve commemorative inscriptions on cliff faces that basically say, "We came. We organised hundreds of men. We took what we wanted. We brought it back safely." When things go smoothly, these networks look like stabilisers. They diversify the economy, supply prestige goods to keep the elite hierarchy happy, and bring in metals that make tools and weapons better. But they're also long, fragile chains. If the central government has trouble mustering ships, guarding caravans, or provisioning remote mining camps, the flow of copper for tools and gold for temple offerings slows down. If provincial leaders start running their own ventures, they gain independent access to wealth and external contacts. If foreign neighbours sense weakness, those trade routes can flip from lifelines into avenues of pressure and attack. For most of the Old Kingdom, none of that seems to threaten the fundamental picture. The Nile keeps rising, granaries fill and empty on schedule, pyramids go up, provincial tombs multiply, trade expeditions come and go. Mat, at least on the official storyboards, is intact, which raises a sharp question for our collapse timeline. What happens when the one thing that underwrites everything else, the reliable Nile flood, stops behaving the way the ideology says it should? If the river comes in low year after year, and the royal granaries can't fully compensate, it's not just a food problem. It's a theology problem, a legitimacy problem, and maybe the king isn't holding up his end of the cosmic bargain problem. As we move into Egypt's first intermediate period, we'll watch what it looks like when a state that bet everything on predictable water suddenly has to improvise in a world where the river and the gods seem less predictable than advertised. When later Egyptian writers looked back on the end of the Old Kingdom, they didn't describe a gentle transition. They described the world falling apart. One text you'll often see quoted is what modern scholars call the Admonitions of Ipuwer. It paints a picture of total inversion. The poor are rich, the rich are poor. Servants own jewellery, nobles beg in the streets. The Nile is blood. Foreigners roam the land. Indeed, the river is blood, and one drinks of it. Indeed, crocodiles are sated with what they have seized. Indeed, the land turns round as does a potter's wheel. It's powerful. It sounds like front-row notes from a collapse. There's just one problem. It was almost certainly written centuries after the fact, and it's probably not journalism at all. It's a kind of literary genre Egyptians loved, a pessimistic reflection on chaos meant to highlight, by contrast, the value of order and a good king. In other words, it might be taking dim cultural memories of hard times and turning them into a moral lesson, not a day-by-day chronicle of what actually happened around 2200 BC. So, if we can't lean on the drama of Ipuwer as straightforward evidence, what can we use? The Nile itself leaves one kind of clue. Sediment cores taken from ancient lake beds and parts of the Nile Delta suggest that around this general period, the river's behaviour got weird. Some records point to episodes of significantly reduced discharge, basically low floods, lining up broadly with the wider 4.2 Kiloyear event. Not every study agrees on the timing or the severity, and the resolution isn't this particular year was a disaster, but a pattern emerges, less dependable water, in Egypt's system that has razor-sharp consequences. The cultivable land is a narrow ribbon along the floodplain. Farmers plan sowing, harvesting, tax payments, and labour obligations around an expected flood height. A series of low Niles doesn't just mean a bit less grain this year. It means the tax calculation stops working. If harvests shrink but royal quotas don't, peasants default, local storehouses empty, and officials have to choose between squeezing harder and letting obligations slide. Do you keep shipping grain north to feed pyramid crews and court officials, or do you keep it back so your own villages don't starve? This is where political fragmentation starts to show up. By the very end of the Old Kingdom, and into what we call the First Intermediate Period, we see provincial elites, those nomarchs from earlier, stepping more fully into the spotlight. In Upper Egypt, places like Thebes and Coptos, in the north, Heracleopolis. Local rulers start using titles that used to be tightly associated with the royal court. They build up their own followings. At some point, they simply stop behaving like officials and start behaving like independent lords. In the archaeology, that shift has a different texture than the literary catastrophes. Royal pyramid building slows, then basically stops. Instead of a single giant monument sucking in labour from the whole country, we see more investment in local tombs and smaller regional temples. Elite burials in the provinces become richer and more elaborate, while royal monuments decline in size and finish. The symbolic centre of gravity moves away from Memphis and out into the nomes. We also see signs of communities fortifying themselves. Some settlements develop walls or strengthened gateways that look less like ceremonial boundaries, and more like people worrying about raids from neighbours, from desert groups, or from rival factions up or down river. In an Egypt that had been relatively unified and inward-focused for centuries, that's a major change in how people thought about security. Economically, there's a pivot too. Instead of everything flowing up to a single royal redistribution machine and then back out, we see more evidence of local production staying local. Pottery styles diversify. Regional workshop traditions flourish. Some areas seem to experiment with new burial customs, new coffin designs, even slightly different religious emphases. Not a total break with Old Kingdom beliefs, but more regional flavours, less tight standardisation from the centre. Is that decline? It depends on where you're standing. From the point of view of a Memphite bureaucrat whose career depended on neatly counted grain rations and royal building programmes, it's a disaster. The old administrative grid comes apart. Central oversight shrinks. Taxes are less reliable. The dream of pharaonic omnipotence fades. From the point of view of a provincial household, it might feel more like opportunity laced with danger. Your local lord can feed you during a bad year because he's no longer shipping every surplus bushel north. He can commission his own temple, patronize his own scribes, negotiate his own deals. But he can also drag you into local wars, retaliate against neighbours, and pull you into systems of obligation that no distant king will arbitrate. Modern historians debate how dark this period really was. Some argue for genuine famine and depopulation in parts of the country, pointing to texts that mention hunger, tomb biographies where nomarchs boast of giving bread to the hungry when the whole land was dying of hunger. Others emphasize continuity. Most villages continue to exist, agricultural techniques don't vanish, and within a couple of centuries, a new dynasty based in Thebes reunifies Egypt and rebrands itself as the restorers of Mat. Another complication for our everything collapses at once narrative is timing. The Old Kingdom's decline and the First Intermediate Period stretch over generations. Depending on which king lists and chronologies you follow, some of the worst political fragmentation may lag behind the sharpest phase of the 4.2 kiloyear climate signal by decades. Some low Niles probably hit earlier, some political effects snowball later. So while it's tempting to draw a straight line, big drought spike on a climate graph, instant Egyptian collapse, that's not quite how it plays out on the ground. The river changes its behaviour. The surplus cushion shrinks. Local elites who are already rising gain leverage. Administrative routines fray, ideology strains to explain why the king no longer seems able to hush Isfet back into its box. Egypt, in other words, doesn't vanish. It reconfigures under stress. And as we shift east to the Indus, we'll see another system that looks very different on the surface. No giant pyramids, no divine pharaohs, but may have been just as vulnerable when its own version of predictable water started to wobble. If you sailed east from Mesopotamia around 2300 BC, hugging the coastline of what's now Iran and Pakistan, you'd start seeing something that didn't quite fit the mental model of civilization built from Egypt and Akkad. No ziggurats, no pyramids, no giant royal statues with names carved 100 times over. Instead, you'd find cities. Lots of them. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, dozens of others. Gridded streets laid out with geometric precision. Neighbourhoods with standardised brick sizes, and, most famously, drains. Indus cities are almost obsessive about water and waste. Houses in Mohenjo-Daro often have their own bathing platforms and toilets, feeding into covered brick sewers running under the streets. Those sewers connect to larger drains that channel wastewater away from residential areas. In some places you see inspection pits, clean-outs, even what look like manhole covers. That sounds mundane, but stack it next to what we've seen elsewhere. In Egypt, monumental stone architecture gets the glory. In Akkad, it's imperial inscriptions and conquering kings. In the Indus, the prestige investment seems to have gone into making sure you can dump out a jar of dirty water from your second-story bathroom without flooding your neighbour's courtyard. This same impulse towards standardization shows up in other places too. The bricks used to build these cities follow consistent proportions across a huge area, often the so-called 1-to-4 ratio. Weights used in trade are carefully calibrated in regular sequences, from tiny bead-sized ones up to hefty blocks. The same basic system shows up from Punjab down to Gujarat and into coastal sites on the Arabian Sea. And behind those weights is an economy humming with specialized craft production. We find entire districts devoted to bead making, shell working, copper smelting, pottery, carnelian drilling. Craftspeople were producing goods at a scale that only makes sense if you're feeding city-wide, even region-wide exchange networks. Mesopotamian texts talk about a place called Meluha, somewhere to the east, sending over exotic woods, semi-precious stones, perhaps cotton textiles, even animals like monkeys. Archaeologists have found Indus-style carnelian beads and etched seals in Mesopotamian cities, and Mesopotamian cylinder seals depict Meluhan merchants arriving by boat in Gulf ports. So the Indus world isn't an isolated experiment. It's plugged into a maritime highway running up the Persian Gulf and into the Tigris-Euphrates system and into overland corridors that tap resources inland. Copper from Rajasthan, lapis and tin routes through Afghanistan, timber and other goods from the Himalayan foothills. Underneath all of this is agriculture, but not a single uniform system. Up in the Punjab and along the upper Indus and its tributaries, farming leans heavily on big rivers and their floodplains, wheat, barley, pulses, maybe some early rice creeping in. Think broad alluvial plains, seasonal floods, and winter rainfall from westerly systems. Farther south and east in Sindh, you get a mix. Major rivers like the Indus itself, but also more dependence on local rainfall and groundwater. Swing down toward Kutch and Saurashtra in Gujarat, and the picture shifts again. Shorter, flashier rivers, more erratic monsoon rains, mixed farming and pastoralism, and eventually coastal sites tuned to maritime trade. So while we talk about the Indus civilization in the singular, what's actually there is a mosaic of regions, some buffered by big snow-fed rivers, others much more at the mercy of the summer monsoon. That regional diversity is important when we try to figure out how this system was put together politically. Because here's the real puzzle. For all the scale and coordination implied by those standardized bricks and weights, we don't see what we would normally call a state. There's no clear royal palace at Mohenjo-Daro equivalent to the massive compounds in Mesopotamian cities. No carved reliefs showing kings smiting enemies. No long royal inscriptions listing campaigns and building projects. Even elite burials are surprisingly modest. You don't get a pharaoh-style tomb that screams, "I own half the valley." Some scholars look at this and argue the Indus world might have been run very differently, through decentralized councils, powerful merchant lineages or city assemblies rather than a single king at the top. Maybe authority was distributed across neighborhoods, guilds and local elites, coordinated by shared standards and religious symbols, rather than enforced by standing armies and divine monarchs. If that's right, it has consequences for how we think about resilience. A system with lots of local autonomy and standardized tools for cooperation, weights, measures, seals, shared iconography might be better at absorbing shocks. If one city falters, others can keep going. If one river changes course, farmers can reorganize around another without the whole ideological edifice of kingship collapsing. And this feeds into why people are cautious about using the word collapse for the Indus. Around and after 2000 BC, we don't see layers of ash from city-wide burnings, mass graves of slaughtered defenders, or dramatic evidence of conquest on an Egyptian or Mesopotamian scale. Instead, we see something subtler. Big cities thinning out or being abandoned, new, smaller settlements popping up in different places, craft production dispersing, long-distance trade with Mesopotamia fading, writing disappearing from everyday use. It looks less like a civilization getting killed from the outside, and more like one choosing, or being forced to stop living in giant brick grids. Deurbanization instead of annihilation. But why? What breaks first in a world like this? Do the maritime and overland trade routes start to stutter? Maybe because Mesopotamia itself is going through its own 4.2 kiloyear headaches, cutting off the flow of prestige goods that held urban elites together. Do river systems like the Gagga-Hakra and some Indus tributaries start shifting course or losing reliability, undercutting the agricultural base of key cities? Or is the deeper driver a change in the monsoon, slightly weaker, more erratic rains that make the fine-tuned balance between river rainfall and groundwater much harder to sustain in places like Gujarat and Sindh? Different lines of evidence point in different directions, and they don't all line up neatly in time. In the next section, we'll zoom in on those clues, the mud in former riverbeds, the silt in abandoned docks, the pollen in ancient lakes, to see which domino in the Indus world seems to wobble first. When you start digging into those clues, the first suspect that shows up on the scene is the monsoon. Not because anyone dug up a clay tablet saying, "Dear Diary, it rained less this year," but because lakes, caves, and seabeds keep their own kind of diary. In lake sediments across South Asia, you can read shifts in the ratio of oxygen isotopes and the kinds of pollen trapped layer by layer. In some cores around and after 2200 BC, you see signatures consistent with drier conditions. Less of the pollen from plants that like heavy summer rain, more from hardier, drought-tolerant species. In speleothems, stalagmites building up in caves over thousands of years, changes in isotopes and growth bands are interpreted as reflecting a weakening or more erratic summer monsoon. None of these records is perfectly dated. Radiocarbon ranges can stretch over centuries, and different lakes and caves respond to climate in slightly different ways. But taken together, a lot of researchers see a pattern. The mighty South Asian monsoon that had helped feed big Indus floodplains seems to wobble, just as other parts of the old world are dealing with their own 4.2 kiloyear weirdness. Layered on top of this climate story is another one that hits even closer to home for the Indus world: rivers that don't stay put. For more than a century, people have argued about the Gagga-Hakra, the dry river course that runs through today's India and Pakistan. In Vedic texts written many centuries after the urban Indus heyday, there's a great river called the Saraswati, flowing mightily between the Yamuna and the Sutlej. Early archaeologists connected the dots and decided the Gagga-Hakra had to be that river, and that its drying up must have killed off Harappan cities along its banks. Newer geomorphology and dating have complicated that neat story. Some studies suggest that the big snow-fed rivers, the Sutlej and the Yamuna, that may once have fed the Gagga had already shifted away, perhaps long before the classic Indus urban phase. In that view, by 2600–2000 BC, the Gagga-Hakra system was mostly a monsoon-fed seasonal river, not a full-blown Himalayan giant, and its decline would be more gradual, more about weaker rains than a single dramatic avulsion event. Other work argues that significant flow persisted into the urban period, and that one or more late Holocene channel shifts did matter for Indus settlements. Even where people agree that rivers changed course, they don't all agree on when or how fast or how directly that mapped onto specific cities. The Indus Plain is a restless environment even in good times. Big rivers like to meander, split, abandon old beds, and carve new ones. Farmers and towns can usually adjust up to a point. This is where archaeology starts to tell you what those climate and river shifts looked like on the ground. If you map Indus sites over time, you see a distinctive pattern. During the mature Harappan urban phase, big cities cluster along major rivers in what's now Pakistan and northwest India, the Indus itself, the Ravi, the Gagga-Hakra region. As you move into the later 2nd millennium BC, those big centres thin out or vanish, and the density of smaller sites picks up to the east in the upper Ganges-Yamuna region and eastern Punjab, settlement size shrinks. Instead of 80-hectare megacities, you get villages and small towns. The same basic ceramic styles carry on, but often in cruder, more local variants. Crafts that had once been concentrated in big urban workshops, faience, high-end bead drilling, standardized seal carving, either disappear or show up in simplified, regionally distinct forms. It's like watching a very integrated, standardized system loosen into a patchwork. You see the same thing in their connections to the wider world. Indus-style seals and beads show up less often in Mesopotamia after around 2000 BC. Cuneiform texts that once mentioned Meluhan ships and merchants fall silent. In coastal Indus sites, the rich mix of imported materials and exotic styles becomes thinner. That could mean trade routes shifted elsewhere. It could mean Mesopotamia's own troubles made the Gulf less profitable. Or it could mean that when your home rivers and rains become unpredictable, sending boats full of luxury goods to far-off clients is no longer top priority. But climate and trade aren't the only possible levers. Some researchers have floated disease as a driver, epidemics rippling through densely packed sewered cities, making dispersed rural living a rational choice. We don't yet have clear pathogen DNA from Indus skeletons to prove that, but it's on the table, especially as ancient DNA methods improve. Others emphasize social reorganization, maybe the same decentralized, relatively egalitarian system that made Indus cities resilient also made them flexible. If long-distance trade became less rewarding, if river risk increased, if monsoon failures hit some regions harder than others, powerful lineages and local communities may simply have decided that massive brick grids and intensively managed urban infrastructure weren't worth the hassle. In that reading, deurbanization isn't failure so much as adaptation, people taking their knowledge, their crops, their crafts, and redeploying them in new ecological niches. And this is why vanished is the wrong word for the Indus. When you track pottery styles, house forms, bead types, even some agricultural practices into the post-urban horizon, you don't see a clean break. You see continuity with modification. The script stops being used on seals, but certain religious symbols like the pipal tree, certain animal motifs, and possibly proto-Siva-like figures seem to echo into later South Asian traditions. The crops don't disappear, they spread. Wheat, barley, pulses and later rice keep feeding communities across northern India. Even the supposed empty Gaga Hakra region isn't actually empty. It shifts from cities to villages, from walls of baked brick to more modest rural sites. So if you zoom out, the Indus transformation looks less like lights going off and more like a dimmer switch sliding down in some places and up in others, as people chased water, stability and opportunity. Which raises a bigger question we'll keep coming back to. When we say collapse, are we mostly watching urban elites lose their preferred way of organizing the world while everyone else quietly keeps going? To see how that question plays out on the opposite side of the Fertile Crescent, we need to move back west into a strip of land where rainfall is just barely enough to make cities possible and never lets them forget it, the Levant. If the Indus world lived by the grace of rivers and monsoons, the Levant lived by the grace of maybe rain. This strip of land between the Mediterranean and the Syrian-Arabian deserts looks lush in travel brochures. But from a farmer's perspective, it's a razor's edge. Most of the big early Bronze Age cities, places like Ebla in northern Syria, or Hazor and Megiddo further south, sit in zones that, on average, get just enough rainfall to grow cereals without irrigation. Not comfortably enough, just enough. Push that rainfall line a little west. You get more reliable fields, olives, vines. Push it a little east, and you're in steppe and semi-desert. Sheep and goats can manage out there with mobility. Wheat cannot. So when the climate gets just a bit drier or just a bit more erratic, those urban systems are the first to feel the knife. Archaeology in the Levant around and after 2200 BC is full of what look like stress signals. Across parts of northern Syria and the middle Euphrates, you see walled towns shrinking or being abandoned. Some sites show burn layers and smashed buildings, followed by decades or centuries with no reoccupation. Others aren't dramatically destroyed. They just quietly wink out of the record, replaced by smaller, more dispersed settlements in the surrounding countryside. Fortification patterns change too. In the 3rd millennium, you get big, showy ramparts and city walls, classic where powerful and organised architecture. By the later Early Bronze 4, Intermediate Bronze Age, you see more hilltop sites, more modest defences, sometimes older walls being patched or reused rather than new monumental systems being built. Settlement maps tell a similar story. Dense clusters of urban sites in some interior plains thin out. The overall number of sites doesn't always crash, instead it redistributes. Small villages and seasonal encampments pop up in what had once been the hinterland, especially toward the steppe margins. That spatial shift hints at a deeper economic one, the balance between farming and herding. In wet or even average years, rain-fed agriculture around the cities is a good bet. You plough, you sow, you harvest, you store. You can feed dense populations and skim off surplus in taxes or tribute. That's the foundation of the palace archives at Ebla, the temple estates at Mari, the urban hierarchies that tie the Levant into the wider Near Eastern economy. But let rainfall drop 10, 15, 20%, or let it become wildly unpredictable from year to year, and suddenly ploughed fields are a liability. You risk putting all your labour into a crop that fails just as the heads are forming. You can compensate with more storage, more careful fallowing, more hierarchy, but only up to a point. Herding, by contrast, rewards flexibility. If the hillsides dry out early, you move the flock. If a local pasture fails, you stretch your migration route, bargain access to someone else's well, push closer to the desert after an unexpected storm. There's evidence that around this time pastoral elements become more prominent in precisely those marginal zones. More temporary sites, more animal bones from hardy grazers. In some readings, the famous Intermediate Bronze culture of southern Levant is essentially a hybrid, semi-sedentary communities with strong pastoral components, filling in the gaps as big urban centres falter. This shift doesn't mean nomads overrun the cities in some simple invasion story. It means that when conditions tilt toward drought, lifestyles built on mobility start to look more attractive or at least more survivable than ones locked into fixed fields. Layered on top of that are the trade routes. The Levant sits on the overland corridor between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Copper from Cyprus, timber from the Lebanon range, luxury goods and ideas all move along those roads and caravan tracks. When Egypt is booming and Akkad or its successors are strong, Levantine cities can thrive as middlemen, tax collectors and production hubs. But that interdependence cuts both ways. If low Niles hit Egypt's grain surplus, if Akkadian control wobbles in northern Mesopotamia, if caravans become less frequent or more dangerous, those same Levantine cities lose revenue and political leverage. Elite households that once depended on skimming off long-distance trade find their flows drying up at the same time as local harvests become riskier. It's tempting to tell this story entirely in terms of war. The archaeological record around 2200 BC in northern Syria does include signs of violent destruction. Cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia talk about Sargon and his successors campaigning west, smiting cities, boasting about conquests in the Upper Sea direction. Later traditions remember Amorite movements, waves of outsiders pressing into the Fertile Crescent. But when you look closely, it's hard to separate cause from effect. Are walls being strengthened because hostile neighbours suddenly got more aggressive? Or because communities that are more mobile, more pastoral, and less tied into central authority are harder to tax and control? Are burn layers the signature of foreign invaders pouring out of the steppe? Or are they the final chapter of cities already weakened by years of bad harvests, unpaid soldiers and frayed alliances? One way to read the Levant around 2200 BC is as a pressure valve between three stressed systems: Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the interior steppe. As rains falter even slightly along that fragile rainfall line, agricultural cores become shakier as empires on either side struggle with their own climate, political and economic problems. Their ability to stabilize the middle weakens. And as the steppe and semi-desert become more precarious, groups who had once been content with wide-ranging herding circuits start eyeing the better-watered zones and the wealth sitting inside their walls. Steppe margins in this context aren't empty backwaters, they're launch pads. Slight shifts in pasture quality, spring reliability, or trade opportunities can tip the balance from coexistence and exchange to raiding, migration, or outright resettlement. We'll see this same dynamic reappear 1,000 years later, with so-called sea peoples, and much later with nomadic confederations on other continental frontiers. But around 2200 BC in the Levant, it's just starting to come into focus, marginal lands turning into engines of movement, in a world where every major state is under weather it doesn't quite understand. To see just how far those ripples can travel, and how fragile early state networks really were, we need to follow the fault line north and west into Anatolia, where metals, mountains and long-distance supply chains added their own twists to the 4.2 Kiloyear unravelling. If the Levant was the narrow land bridge between big river systems, Anatolia was the block of mountains looming above the whole conversation. On a map, it's that broad peninsula that will one day be called Asia Minor. In the 3rd millennium BC, it's a patchwork of plateaus, river valleys and high ridges sitting between the Aegean, the Black Sea and northern Mesopotamia. What made it matter wasn't just geography, it was what lay under the ground and on the slopes. Copper, silver, later tin, dense forests of oak and pine, pastures in the uplands, cereals in the river plains. If you're Egypt, starved for timber and metals, or if you're Mesopotamia, hungry for anything you can't grow on irrigated mud, Anatolia is a treasure chest upstream. And like any good treasure chest, it comes with locks. We don't have an Anatolian super-empire at 2200 BC. No unified Hittite kingdom yet. Instead, we see a mosaic of local polities, city-states, hilltop centres, fortified towns, some plugged into long-distance trade, others more inward-looking. Places like Arslan Tepe in the east, Troy in the northwest, and a whole constellation of less famous sites across central Anatolia show something striking in the centuries before and around 2200, palace economies. Storage complexes with big jars and ceilings, administrative tablets, workshops for metalworking and textile production. These aren't just villages with a chief, they're centralized systems where elites control the flow of goods. Grain and animals come in as tax and tribute, metals, crafted objects, and maybe military support go out. Somewhere down the line, caravans pick up those ingots, those finished items, and push them towards Syria, Mesopotamia, the Aegean, perhaps even Egypt. That kind of economy is powerful when things run smoothly. It lets a small ruling class coordinate labour, concentrate resources, and turn surplus into diplomatic gifts or military pay. It's also fragile in a very specific way, because so much is routed through the palace, through storerooms, scribes, and elite households, Disruptions don't just lower everyone's income a bit. They snap key links in the chain. Imagine you're a central Anatolian ruler whose status depends on sending reliable copper shipments to a big partner in the south. In return, you get prestige items, maybe grain in bad years, maybe political backing in your local rivalries. Then, over a few decades, the south gets weird. Low Niles mean Egypt is buying less timber and copper. Akkad is having trouble holding its northern territories, so the security of caravan routes through the upper Euphrates and northern Syria is no longer guaranteed. Levantine middlemen are under their own climate and political pressures. Caravans thin out, prices wobble. Maybe one year your traders come back late. The next, they don't come back at all. You still have your local fields and flocks, but now your palace workshops are idle. The prestige economy dries up. The officials and guards whose loyalty you once paid in metal, grain, and imported luxuries suddenly look around and wonder if this particular palace is worth dying for. Meanwhile, the climate doesn't hit every part of Anatolia the same way. That's another crucial piece. This isn't a single flat river plain where one drought pattern tells the whole story. The Anatolian highlands catch snow and rain differently from the coastal lowlands. Some river valleys might enjoy near normal flows while upland pastures dry out. Elsewhere, heavy winter snows followed by rapid melt can mean floods instead of drought. Paleoclimate records, lake cores, cave deposits hint at increased variability around this time. Not necessarily permanent desiccation, but swings. Good years and bad years may be in sharper alternation. For a palace economy trying to plan grain storage, tax collection, and caravan provisioning over multiple years, that kind of variability is poison. You can ride out a couple of bad harvests with good accounting and fat granaries. You can't build stable politics on maybe this year the snowpack will exist. Maybe it won't. On the ground, archaeology shows something that mirrors the patchwork climate. At some sites you do see destruction. Burned palace complexes at Arslan Tepe around the end of the 3rd millennium. Dramatic changes at Troy through to Troy III, with debates over whether we're seeing earthquake, fire, war, or some combination. At other sites, there's no fiery apocalypse, just a reorganization. Large, centralized complexes shrink or disappear. New neighborhoods grow up without the same monumental architecture. Small settlements pop up in landscapes that were once dominated by a few big nodes. In some regions, metalworking practices change. Standardized large-scale production geared for export seems to give way, at least temporarily, to more local small-batch work. The big highways of metal and timber that linked Anatolia to the south and west look less like 4-lane roads and more like a network of side streets. That's another way collapse can look. Not the end of people or culture, but a rebalancing between centre and periphery. When palace economies falter, hinterlands that once fed them and shipped through them can become more autonomous. Local chiefs who used to be subordinates to a regional capital can start acting like full rulers in their own right. Trade doesn't vanish, it reroutes. Instead of one big funnel run by a palace, you get multiple smaller channels run by village alliances, clan leaders, and opportunistic traders. From the perspective of a scribe in a burning administrative building, that's the end of the world. From the perspective of a herder in an upland valley who now trades directly with a coastal port, it might feel like a loosening of chains. And again, it's hard to disentangle cause and effect. Did climate-driven variability push local communities to abandon over-centralized systems and return to more flexible arrangements? Did the weakening of Akkadian and Egyptian demand for Anatolian resources undermine the big nodes that had grown rich on exports? Or did internal rivalries and social tensions in those palace societies erupt just as external conditions turned against them? What we can say is that around the 4.2 kiloyear mark, Anatolia stops looking like a simple resource reservoir feeding great powers at its edges, and starts to look like a region in its own right, with shifting internal centres of gravity. That matters, because it shows us that the 2200 BC crisis isn't just about big river civilizations crashing. It's also about the support structures around them, the metal sources, the timberlands, the caravan corridors, twisting, fracturing, and reconfiguring. And those fractures don't stop at the mountain ridges. Follow the copper, the timber, and the shifting trade winds a little further west and south, and you end up in another zone that will become famous for late Bronze Age drama, the Aegean and the wider eastern Mediterranean, where the 4.2 kiloyear event may have played out on yet another, very different stage. When we slide west out of Anatolia and down along the coasts, the story doesn't get simpler. It gets messier, because in the early Bronze Age Aegean and the wider eastern Mediterranean around 2200 BC, we're not looking at one big river civilization with a single centre and clear dates. We're looking at dozens of coastal plains, islands and uplands, each with its own rhythm. Take the Aegean first, on the Greek mainland. In what archaeologists call early Helladic III, you have towns like Lerna in the Argolid. A couple of centuries earlier, Lerna was famous for its House of the Tiles, a large, corridor-style building with tiled roof and storerooms. Not a palace in the Mesopotamian sense, but definitely a central building with administrative vibes. By roughly 2200 BC, that world changes. The House of the Tiles is destroyed by fire, never rebuilt in the same way. Over its ruins, someone piles a mound and a ring of stones. Not a neat continuity of the old system, but also not a ghost town. People are still there, just reorganised. Across parts of the mainland you see something similar. Earlier big buildings vanish, settlement patterns shift, pottery styles change pretty abruptly. Some sites shrink, others move to more defensible spots. Fortification walls appear or are strengthened. It's disruption, yes, but not always abandonment. Now look across the water to the Cyclades and Crete. Some Cycladic island communities show downturns or changes in burial practices around this horizon. On Crete, though, things look almost upside down compared to the collapse story elsewhere. Roughly in the centuries after 2200, the island is moving toward its first palaces. Knossos, Phaistos, and others will soon rise. Population seems to be growing, architecture becoming more complex, exchange networks expanding. Same sea, very different local trajectories. Farther east again, along the Anatolian and Levantine coasts, early Bronze Age harbour towns and coastal sites show their own mix of continuity and shock. Some are hit, burned or abandoned. Others pivot and survive, plugging into whatever new patterns of trade and politics emerge as Akkad weakens and Egypt enters its own rough patch. One thread runs through many of these places, concern with defence. Fortifications, bastions, gated entrances, features that had existed before now become more common or more massive at certain sites. That doesn't tell us who the enemy was. It might be seaborne raiders, it might be rival inland groups, it might just be a general feeling that the world is less predictable. But it does tell us that local leaders were investing resources in walls and gates rather than just big storage halls. And behind those walls, exchange is still happening. The Aegean is laced into maritime trade by this point. Obsidians, metals, fine ceramics, and probably perishable goods are moving by boat between islands, coasts, and river mouths. That sea traffic can act as a buffer. If your immediate hinterland has a bad year, you can import grain or other staples from somewhere that got more rain. But the sea is a two-edged tool. because once your community leans heavily on maritime supply lines, it inherits maritime vulnerabilities. Stormier weather, fewer safe harbours, piracy, failing partners on the other end of the route, any of those can snap the lifeline. If the 4.2 Kiloyear event involved shifts in storm tracks and wind patterns over the Mediterranean, and some climate models and marine cores suggest it did, then the very networks that made island and coastal life resilient in stable times could become liabilities. Ships sail less often. Risk goes up. Insurance doesn't exist. In that kind of world, you might expect a patchwork response. Some coastal elites double down on trade, fortifying harbours and controlling anchorages. Others retreat to inland or upland sites where rainfall is a bit more reliable, even if they lose easy access to seaborne luxuries. Some communities fragment. Others manage to turn disruption into opportunity, rising as new intermediaries when older nodes falter. This is why claims of perfect synchrony in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean are especially hard to defend. Our timelines here are built from pottery styles, radiocarbon dates with error bars, and cross-links to Egyptian and Mesopotamian chronologies that are themselves debated. When you look closely, the supposed 2200 BC collapse in one microregion might actually peak a century earlier. Another might show its sharpest break a century later. Some places even show an apparent boom right when others are struggling. That doesn't mean nothing connects them. It just means the connection is more like a storm system moving over a varied landscape than a single switch being flipped. Maybe regional drought pressures hit marginal plains and rain-fed farms first, squeezing communities that didn't have big irrigation systems or deep storage. Maybe that stress triggered more raiding and conflict, which in turn encouraged fortification and occasional burning of rival towns. Or maybe some of the change is internal, emerging elites pushing new social models, consolidating power in some places, getting violently overthrown in others. Climate stress and political experiments don't have to be separate stories. They can reinforce each other, making every bad harvest and every failed shipment more politically explosive. When you step back, the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean around 2200 BC looked less like a neat entry in a catalogue of collapses, and more like a cluster of overlapping experiments under strain. Some end abruptly in ash. Some fade slowly into new configurations. Some, like early Crete, seem to take the turbulence and turn it into the launch pad for the next big thing. That's why this region works best in our story as a cautionary comparison. If you go hunting for a single synchronized moment when the entire Eastern Mediterranean world crashed in lockstep with Akkad, Old Kingdom Egypt, and the Indus, you'll be forcing diverse evidence into a Procrustean bed. The Aegean shoreline, the Levantine harbours, and the Anatolian coasts are telling us something more complicated, that even under broadly similar environmental pressures, societies fracture, adapt and transform on their own timelines. Keep that in mind, because as we dive deeper into the climate evidence itself next, the temptation will be strong to draw sharp, simple lines between a spike in some core sample and a wave of burning cities. The maritime world of the early 2nd millennium BC is a reminder that the real picture is rarely that tidy. To see what might have been happening to the climate around 2200 BC, we have to leave the ruins for a minute and stare at mud, ice, and cave drips. Because most of what we think we know about the 4.2 Kiloyear event doesn't come from ancient scribes complaining about the weather. It comes from what climate scientists call proxies, indirect records that stand in for rain, dust, and temperature. Start with lakes and wetlands. When a lake quietly accumulates mud year after year, it's building a layered archive. Within those layers you can measure things like grain size and mineral content. Coarser, dustier layers often mean drier, windier conditions. Finer, organic rich layers tend to mean wetter periods, when plants were thriving and erosion was lower. In some Near Eastern lakes around the 4.2 thousand years ago mark, you see a shift toward more dust and less organic material, the signature of drying. In others, that shift is subtle or doesn't show up at all. Already the global event starts to look like a patchwork. Then there are speleothems, cave formations like stalagmites. When rainwater seeps through soil and drips into a cave, it leaves behind tiny layers of calcite. The chemistry of those layers, especially the ratio of oxygen and carbon isotopes, is sensitive to rainfall patterns and moisture sources. A stalagmite can grow for thousands of years, leaving a barcode of wetter and drier times. Some caves in the Levant and the Zagros show clear anomalies around 2200 BC, a shift toward isotopic values that suggest reduced rainfall or changes in seasonality. But caves in other regions don't line up as neatly. A dry pulse might start earlier, peak later, or not appear at all. Move to the oceans. Marine sediment cores pulled from the eastern Mediterranean and Arabian Sea contain layers rich in wind-blown dust from nearby deserts. When the climate is dry and vegetation cover shrinks, more dust is mobilized. Storms carry it farther, and you get a spike in those layers. Around the 4.2 Kiloyear horizon, several cores show increases in dust flux. That's one of the pillars behind the idea of a regional drought crisis stretching from the Levant to Mesopotamia and beyond. But again, the timing is not a razor-thin line, it's a broad smear, sometimes spanning a couple of centuries. And then there's the dating problem. When we say 2200 BC, we're using a neat number that fits nicely on a timeline. But radiocarbon dates come with error bars, 50, 100, sometimes 200 years either way, depending on the material and the calibration curve. Stalagmites can be dated with uranium-thorium methods that are often more precise, but still not pinpoint exact years. Lake cores might be anchored by a handful of radiocarbon ages plus assumptions about how steadily sediment accumulated. So when someone tells you this stalagmite shows drought at 2200 BC and this city burned down at 2200 BC, they might actually be talking about events anywhere between, say, 2350 and 2050 BC. Overlapping may be related, but not a single bad harvest season. That fuzziness matters, because it's one thing to say a broad period of climatic stress overlaps with several episodes of social disruption. It's another to claim this specific drought year toppled this specific empire. The evidence usually isn't that sharp. There's also the issue of regional patchiness. Monsoon-fed systems like parts of the Indus basin and much of South Asia respond primarily to the strength and timing of the summer monsoon. Westerly-fed systems like Mesopotamia, the Levant, and much of the eastern Mediterranean depend more on winter storms carried in by the mid-latitude westerly winds. If the monsoon weakens but the westerlies stay relatively stable, you can get crisis in one zone but resilience in another. If the westerlies shift south while the monsoon belt reorganizes to the east, you might see severe drying in one river valley, only modest change next door, and even increased rainfall somewhere else. That's exactly what the proxies suggest. Some Arabian Sea records point to a weakened summer monsoon around this time. Certain Levantine and Mesopotamian archives point to reduced winter rainfall and more frequent dust storms. Meanwhile, parts of Egypt's Nile flood regime change, but don't simply collapse. Cretan proxies don't scream catastrophe. Some Anatolian records are ambiguous. So how do researchers decide whether these scattered blips belong to the same story? They start with correlation. Do shifts in different archives happen roughly in the same window of time? Then they look for mechanism. Is there a plausible physical link? Changes in solar output, shifts in ocean circulation, reorganization of the atmosphere, that could explain why monsoons and westerlies might both be affected. Finally, they hunt for direct evidence connecting climate stress to human response. That might be layers of wind-blown dust inside abandoned irrigation canals. It might be pollen records showing fields reverting to steppe or desert plants, right when settlements shrink. It might be textual hints, letters from Mesopotamian officials complaining of famine and failed canals at the same time that lake cores show a drying trend. Even then, the strongest statements tend to sound like this. Climatic aridification likely contributed to, or environmental stress appears to have been a major factor in, not the drought did it, case closed. And that's the key idea to carry forward. Climate is incredibly powerful. A few bad flood years, a decade of missing monsoons, a shift in storm tracks, these can all put enormous pressure on food systems, trade networks, and political legitimacy. But climate is usually a trigger, not the whole explanation. The same dry spell can produce very different outcomes depending on how a society is organized, how it stores grain, who controls water, how flexible its elites are, whether people can move or are locked in place. To understand why so many different regions stumble in roughly the same broad window around 2200 BC, we need to keep the proxies in view, the cave drips, the dusty cores, the fickle monsoon charts, but we can't stop there. We have to translate a shift in rainfall into something more concrete. How many mouths can you feed when the river drops? How fast your stores run out? And what happens politically when ration lines form and caravans stop showing up? That's where we're going next. When people hear drought, they usually picture cracked earth and empty wells. But for a state-level society, the real killer isn't the dryness itself. It's the math. Start with something deceptively simple. Crops don't respond to rain in a straight line. Imagine a farmer on the Euphrates planting barley. Barley is tough. It can handle salty soils, short seasons, and mediocre rainfall. But it still has thresholds. Give it 100% of the water it wants, and you get a bumper harvest. Drop that to, say, 90%, and the yield might only fall 5%. Annoying but survivable. Push it down to 70%, and suddenly the harvest might crash by 30 or 40%. Go much lower and whole fields fail. That's because plants have critical periods, flowering, grain filling, when missing water hurts far more than at other times. A slightly later flood, a shorter monsoon, a shift in when winter storms arrive can mean the right amount of water at the wrong time. On a graph, it doesn't look like a gentle slope. It's a cliff. Now scale that up to an empire. States like Akkad or Old Kingdom Egypt were built on this kind of finely tuned balance. Their great strength was turning an unpredictable river or rainfall pattern into something more stable through storage, taxation, and redistribution. In a good year, farmers produce more grain than their families can eat. The state steps in. Officials take a slice as tax, store it in granaries, and move it where it's needed, to cities, garrisons, work crews building temples and canals. On paper, this is resilience. You're spreading risk over space and time. But that system only works if you can skim a surplus off the countryside every year. Run the numbers. Suppose average production is 100 units. Peasants need 70 to stay alive and keep farming. The state takes 20 as tax and leaves 10 as wiggle room, seed grain, small savings, charity. Drop harvests by 15% for a decade. Now you're at 85 units. The state still wants 20 because soldiers, officials and workers don't become 15% cheaper overnight. That leaves 65 for the farmers below subsistence. They start eating seed grain, selling livestock, taking out loans. If the palace is merciful and cuts its take to 15, it can ease the pain, but it's now running a budget deficit. Those stored surpluses you've been counting on, they drain fast when 2 or 3 bad years hit in a row. The granaries that symbolize state power become a countdown clock. And redistribution has another hidden trap. It centralizes responsibility. When the king claims credit for making the Nile flood, or for feeding the land, he's also volunteering as the person everyone will blame when it goes wrong. All of this is sitting on top of physical infrastructure that needs constant care: canals, dikes, feeder channels, storage basins. Irrigation turns a fickle river into a predictable grid of fields, until it doesn't. Canals silt up. Salts accumulate in badly drained soils. A slightly weaker flood might not have enough energy to scour channels clean. Suddenly, upstream villages are still irrigated, but downstream fields are dry. Who gets water first is no longer just a matter of gravity. It's politics. We actually see this in later Mesopotamian texts. Lawsuits over blocked canals, accusations that one city is stealing the flow, royal edicts threatening anyone who diverts water without permission. Under stress, every decision about where to send scarce labour, dredging this canal, not that one, can create winners and losers. Add a few dry years and those resentments pile up. If you're downstream and your harvest fails while upstream landlords are still irrigating their fields, it doesn't feel like climate change. It feels like someone is cheating you. Meanwhile, prices start to move. In normal times, grain prices bounce around. Harvests vary. Caravans are late. But when a shortfall hits across an entire region, you get spikes. We have records from various ancient Near Eastern periods where the price of barley, wool, and other staples suddenly multiplies several times over. When grain doubles or triples in price while wages lag behind, people have 2 options: sell assets or borrow. Debt becomes the bridge between bad harvests and social crisis. Farmers mortgage their fields, their children, even themselves. Urban poor who rely completely on purchased food suddenly can't afford bread. In later eras, we see kings periodically issuing clean slate decrees, cancelling debts to prevent the whole system from tearing itself apart. The fact those amnesties exist tells you how quickly price shocks could translate into social stress. Cities feel this more brutally than anyone. Urban centres are density machines. That's their whole point: pack people together to specialise, trade, administer. But that density makes them incredibly vulnerable to food and water disruption. Most city dwellers don't grow their own food. They depend on a constant inflow of grain, oil, beer and fuel from the countryside and from other regions. A 20% harvest shortfall in the hinterland might mean a 40 or 50% reduction in what actually reaches the city once local elites and soldiers have taken their cut. Water is the same story. Wells and cisterns can buffer a dry spell, but if river levels drop or canals fail, urban water quality nosedives. Contaminated supplies mean disease. Crowded neighbourhoods with marginal sanitation turn a small shock into an epidemic. So a bad climate decade doesn't just mean less food. It means short harvests that cross critical thresholds, canals that no longer behave the way they're supposed to, state stores that empty faster than they refill, prices that detach from ordinary people's ability to pay, debt chains that tighten around the poor first, and then around middling landowners. Cities where hunger and sickness are concentrated in one combustible place. This is what historians and systems thinkers call cascading failure. Food production is tied to water management. Water management is tied to labour and politics. Politics is tied to taxation and legitimacy. Urban life is tied to all of the above. Tug hard on one strand, a persistent shift in rainfall, a string of low floods, a wobble in the monsoon, and the vibrations travel. Not every state in 2200 BC hit every rung of that ladder. Some bent, improvised, or shrank without fully collapsing. Others were already fragile for different reasons. Succession disputes, overextension, internal inequality, and climate stress just kicked out the last supports. And this is before we add another layer. What happens when the same shortages that hit farmers also hit merchants, caravan routes, and long-distance trade in copper, tin, and luxury goods? That's where we're going next. When we talk about trade networks in the early Bronze Age, it's easy to imagine a few dusty caravans plodding along between neighbouring cities. The reality was bigger, stranger, and a lot more fragile. By around 2300–2200 BC, much of the Old World from Egypt to the Indus was tied together by flows of stuff that almost nobody could live without, even if they didn't realise it yet. Start with metals. Bronze doesn't exist in nature. You have to make it, and to make it, you need copper and tin in the right proportions. Copper was relatively common. Cyprus, Anatolia, the Caucasus, Oman, the Iranian Plateau, Central Asia. Different regions had their favourite sources. Akkadian scribes talk about copper coming from Magan and Dilmun. Aegean sites are plugged into Anatolian and Cypriot ore. In the Indus, copper moves from Rajasthan and Oman toward the big cities. Tin was the problem. Usable tin deposits are rare and scattered. Much of the Bronze Age depended on a handful of poorly understood sources somewhere in Central Asia, Iran, Anatolia, maybe Afghanistan. That means the weapon your guard carries in Mesopotamia, the chisel your stonecutter uses in Egypt, the tools that carve seals in the Indus, all ultimately depend on caravans and trade routes stretching hundreds or thousands of kilometres. Cut those routes even partially, and bronze production doesn't slow down gracefully. It can fall off a cliff, but metals were only part of the system. Grain moved when one region had a bumper crop and another was short. Merchants and states stepped in. We have later evidence from Egypt shipping grain to feed workers on distant projects, Mesopotamian cities importing barley or dates from their hinterlands and neighbours. Textiles moved the other way. Wool and fine cloth from one zone might be exchanged for timber from another, or lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, or resin and wine from the Levant. And people moved, labourers, soldiers, craftsmen, enslaved captives. Akkadian kings deported, conquered populations to work land and build infrastructure. The Indus seems to have sent specialised artisans westward to Mesopotamia. These movements weren't just side effects of empire. They were part of how the system functioned. So when climate stress hits agriculture, it doesn't just stress farmers and kings. It quietly undercuts this whole web. Imagine a drought decade in northern Mesopotamia. Harvests shrink, pastoral flocks are under pressure, banditry ticks up as desperate groups raid caravans. A merchant who used to finance a long-distance tin expedition decides the risk is no longer worth it. Another sends fewer donkeys. A ruler who once guaranteed safe passage through his territory can't patrol the roads anymore because he's busy putting down local revolts. Credit starts to wobble. In the Bronze Age, long-distance trade wasn't usually paid up front in cash. It ran on promises, tablets, seals, reputations. A trader in the Gulf might receive copper or timber on credit, promising to pay back with grain, textiles, silver, or labour down the line. Temples and palaces often underwrote these ventures, advancing goods or rations in return for a slice of the profits. Now add a few bad years. The merchant who owes you copper can't deliver because pirates hit his ship. The guy who was supposed to send barley is sitting in a city whose hinterland just failed. There is no surplus. The palace that guaranteed the loan suddenly has a revenue crisis of its own and starts calling in debts instead of extending new ones. Once a few of these links snap, trust evaporates, caravans become juicier targets for raiders because every donkey train is now a lifeline. Sea routes look more attractive until coastal communities, equally stressed, turn to piracy. Merchants reroute around unsafe zones, leaving older hubs stranded. A town that once thrived as a way station on a copper route can wither fast if everyone simply detours 50 kilometers to the east. How do we see this breakdown thousands of years later? Not through neat collapse memos, but through absences and distortions. Archaeologists track distributions of specific goods, types of pottery, particular kinds of stone vessels, standardized copper ingots, exotic materials like lapis, carnelian, or certain shells. In good times, you see these spread widely and predictably. Indus carnelian beads in Mesopotamian cities, Mesopotamian cylinder seals showing Meluha merchants, Egyptian artifacts turning up in Levantine ports, Anatolian metals appearing in the Aegean. Then, in some regions around the 22nd century BC, those patterns thin or fragment. Imported luxuries become rarer in tombs, the range over which certain distinctive artifacts travel contracts. Local imitations pop up where the real stuff no longer arrives. You also see changes in the bureaucratic tools of trade, seals and sealings. Cities that once used seal impressions on clay to control flows of goods sometimes show a sharp drop in the volume and variety of these impressions. Others show shifts in iconography and administration, suggesting that old trade partnerships and institutional arrangements have broken down and are being replaced or not replaced at all. Ships and routes leave subtler traces. Wrecks are rare this early, but harbour installations, coastal settlements, and anchorages can tell a story. Some ports shrink or are abandoned, others rise as traffic reroutes. Inland, caravanserai-like sites or fortified way stations appear or vanish. The map of connectivity is being redrawn by stress. Why does this matter for collapse? Because a lot of elite legitimacy was quietly pegged to these networks. Palaces and temples weren't just grain warehouses. They were also redistribution centres for prestige goods. Gold from somewhere else, fine textiles woven from imported wool or dyed with imported pigments, rare stones, exotic animals, fragrant oils. These weren't trivial luxuries. They were how kings displayed their special status, how they paid off allies, how they decorated the gods. If you're an Egyptian official in the late Old Kingdom, your tomb biography boasts about the foreign lands you visited, the incense you brought back, the cedar beams you procured. If you're an Akkadian king, your inscriptions brag about copper, timber, and captives from distant mountains and seas. If those flows dry up, it's not just the jewellery box that suffers. It's the story you tell about why you, specifically, deserve to rule. You promised the gods lavish offerings. You promised your soldiers pay and plunder. You promised your scribes and priests a cut of the goods passing through your hands. All of that depends on stable exchange. So when climate stress squeezes farmers, that pressure radiates outward. Less surplus to trade, more risk and violence on the routes, credit chains that buckle, ports that empty out, elites who suddenly can't access the very things that mark them as elites. This is where our regional cases start to diverge. In the Akkadian sphere and northern Mesopotamia, we see signs of settlement abandonment, contraction of long-distance connections, and later memories of the Amorites and other mobile groups, filling in the gaps. In parts of the Levant, imported Egyptian and Mesopotamian goods become rarer as local styles flourish, suggesting partial withdrawal from wider exchange. In contrast, the Indus seems to show a more gradual reorientation of trade, rather than an overnight crash, with coastal hubs shifting and inland cities slowly losing their long-distance sparkle. Not every place experiences the same degree of trade shock at the same time, But enough of the system wobbles that by 2200 BC, Interdependence, the thing that once made these societies rich and resilient, starts to behave like a trap. When scarcity and insecurity rise together, caravans and ships stop being symbols of prosperity and start looking like targets. Merchants arm themselves. Border guards get jumpier. Local rulers decide that raiding a neighbour's caravan is easier than honouring a trade treaty. The line between economic stress and organised violence gets very thin. And once that line blurs, our story moves from shortages and prices to something harder to measure, but just as important, migrations, raids, and the murky world of invasions that later scribes love to blame for everything. When fields fail and herds start dying, people have two basic options: hold on and hope, or move. For early Bronze Age farmers in rain-fed zones, a few bad years could be brutal but survivable. You tighten belts, sell animals, call in favours, but stack droughts back to back, add banditry on the roads and a palace that's suddenly more interested in tax arrears than tax relief, and the math changes. Staying put starts to look like a slow death. Leaving becomes the risky option that at least offers a sliver of hope. Pastoralists ride that edge even more sharply. If you keep sheep, goats or cattle on marginal land, you are always chasing grass and water. In a normal year, that means seasonal migrations, up to the steppe in wet months, back down to cultivated zones in dry ones, negotiating pasture rights with farmers and city-states, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. In a bad decade, the safe zones shrink. Wells dry, traditional grazing agreements break down, and the seasonal part of seasonal mobility can quietly dissolve into permanent relocation. To later scribes sitting in cities, this can look very simple, and then the foreigners came. In reality, it's rarely a single horde on a single day. It's families moving a little farther each year. It's herders who used to winter just outside your borders, now pressing deeper in, because the wells on their side have failed. It's refugees from one failed town being resettled as labourers, soldiers or tenant farmers in another kingdom. From the ground, migration feels like a slow bleed, not a thunderclap. How do we see any of this thousands of years later? Archaeologists have to play detective with very indirect clues. One big line of evidence is material culture, especially pottery. Different regions develop very distinctive ceramic styles, shapes, clay recipes, decorations. When you dig a site, and suddenly a new kind of pot shows up in people's kitchens and keeps showing up, that can mean newcomers have arrived, bringing their habits with them. If those pots are only in elite houses, maybe it's just trade. If they appear in simple homes, graves, and trash pits across a region, that's stronger evidence that people, not just goods, are moving. Then there are isotopes, tiny chemical fingerprints locked into teeth and bones. The water you drink and the food you eat as a child carry particular ratios of elements like strontium and oxygen depending on local geology and climate. Your teeth record that signature. If you're buried in northern Mesopotamia, but your strontium ratio screams Central Anatolia, you're a migrant. When entire cemeteries show a mix of local and non-local signatures, you're looking at communities that absorbed outsiders generation after generation. Burial practices add another layer. People are surprisingly conservative about how they treat their dead. If a region has long favoured crouched burials under house floors with simple goods, and suddenly we see extended burials in separate cemeteries with new kinds of jewellery and grave offerings, that's not just fashion. It often reflects new groups, or at least new ideas about identity and ancestry, entering the landscape. Now put that toolkit next to the stories written by the literate elites. Akkadian, later Babylonian, and Egyptian texts love clear labels: Amorites, sand dwellers, Asiatics, those of the steppe. They talk about them as if they're homogeneous nations with one personality, lazy, treacherous, violent, uncivilized, until the day a king boasts of having made them submit and put them to work. But those labels are political tools, not ethnographic reports. Amorite, for example, probably covered a messy spectrum of West Semitic speaking groups, some fully settled, some semi-nomadic, some hired as mercenaries, some raiding on their own account. Egypt's Asiatics ranged from caravan merchants and famine refugees to brigands and palace-sponsored settlers in the delta. When a scribe says the Amorites flooded the land, that might encompass decades of trickling movement, changing alliances, and people switching lifestyles in response to stress. Archaeology supports that messiness. In the centuries around 2200 BC, many regions show signs not of sudden replacement, but of mixing. In the Levant, new pastoral nomadic ceramic styles appear in inland zones while older urban styles linger on the coast. In northern Mesopotamia, some abandoned farming villages are replaced by campsites or small fortified sites with different pottery and animal bones, suggesting more mobile groups moving into former agricultural land. In a few places, isotope studies show rising numbers of non-locals buried alongside locals, implying that migration wasn't just invasion, it was incorporation. Within that broad pattern, you can sketch several scenarios. One is gradual infiltration, small groups of herders or displaced farmers entering a state's territory as hired labour, tenant cultivators, or allied tribes. Over time, their numbers and bargaining power grow. They might eventually dominate local politics or even seize control, but from the outside it looks like continuity, the same city, the same institutions, just with different families on top. Another is intensified seasonal movement. Pastoralists who once kept a respectful distance from cities might in dry years push their flocks right up to irrigated fields, demanding grazing rights, fodder or grain. That creates friction with farmers and administrators. A few violent incidents, a few punitive campaigns, and suddenly you have a cycle of raids and reprisals that texts later compress into "the land was overrun." And then there are genuine refugee waves. When a cluster of settlements collapses because of drought, flood, or war, survivors often head toward the remaining centres of stability, better watered river valleys, fortified towns, thriving ports. Those centres can absorb newcomers up to a point. Beyond that, you get crowded slums, land disputes, soaring inequality, and plenty of angry young men with nothing to lose. Newcomers don't just bring problems, though. From a ruler's perspective, migrants can be an opportunity. Need soldiers? Recruit those tough steppe herders. Need marginal land brought under cultivation? Settle displaced farmers there with tax breaks. Need to revive a flagging economy? Encourage foreign merchants and craftsmen to move in, bringing new techniques and trade links. We actually see this double edge on the Mesopotamia-Levant frontier. The same Amorite groups that Akkadian texts curse as destroyers later appear as dynasty founders. By a few centuries after the Akkadian collapse, major city-states, Babylon, Mari, others, are ruled by kings with Amorite names, running perfectly recognizable Mesopotamian bureaucracies. Mobile lineages that may have pressured old regimes during the drought crisis become the backbone of new political orders once the dust settles. In the Levant, too, the centuries after 2200 BC show a patchwork of fortified hilltop sites, mobile herding communities, and shrunken or transformed towns. Some scholars read this as collapse under nomadic assault. Others see a rebalancing between city-based farming and more flexible pastoral strategies in a harsher climate. Either way, the borderlands between Mesopotamian plains and Levantine uplands look like classic flashpoints, zones where drought-driven movement, weakened states, and armed caravans all intersect. This matters for how we tell the story of 2200 BC. If we picture invasions as the main cause, faceless barbarians pouring in and burning everything, we miss the deeper processes. Climate stress pushing both farmers and herders to move, trade breakdown making those movements more dangerous, states alternately exploiting and fearing the very migrants they depend on. We also miss the continuity. Many of the people later blamed as invaders were already inside the system, woven into its armies, its labour forces, its marriage networks. When things went wrong, they didn't just arrive from nowhere. They were already there, and their choices, like everyone else's, were shaped by a world where food was scarcer, routes were riskier, and old guarantees no longer held. Seen this way, migration isn't a separate cause of collapse. It's a symptom of other stresses, and at the same time, one of the main ways societies try to cope with those stresses. Sometimes that coping mechanism helped states adapt and survive. Sometimes it tipped already fragile polities over the edge. And in that grey zone between adaptation and breakdown, another force was always lurking in the background, one the texts talk about a lot more openly: raiding, warfare, and organised violence. When people start moving and resources start shrinking, violence almost always shows up somewhere in the story. The tricky part is figuring out what kind. Archaeologists talk about different signatures of conflict, and they don't all mean the same thing. The most dramatic is the classic destruction layer. You dig down and hit a horizon of burned mud brick, collapsed walls, smashed pottery, slingstones, arrowheads. Sometimes there are bodies left where they fell. That's the archaeological equivalent of a crime scene. Something sudden and nasty happened. But you can also see societies bracing for trouble before the massacre ever comes, or even if it never does. Militarization shows up in weaponry. Earlier you might find a few daggers or hunting points in elite graves. In more tense periods, suddenly there are mass-produced spearheads, standardized arrow points, whole cemeteries where half the adult males are buried with weapons. Armor fragments, helmets, specialized warrior gear begin to appear. That suggests not just the occasional raid, but a social shift. More men trained and equipped for organized fighting. More resources poured into violence. Fortifications tell another part of the story. In peaceful phases, cities might rely on a modest wall or simple ditch. Around and after 2200 BC, some regions suddenly sprout massive ramparts, glacis slopes, towers, and elaborate gate complexes. Towns that had been open or lightly defended now have ring walls. Rural sites move onto hilltops or defensible spurs. That doesn't prove war caused collapse, but it does show people expected trouble and were investing heavily to prepare for it. So what are they all afraid of? One big model is simple resource competition. In a drying world, three things matter above all: reliable water, arable land, and grazing corridors. If canals are running low, upstream farmers can literally steal downstream harvests by diverting more water. If rainfall belts retreat, previously marginal hills suddenly look like prime real estate. Traditional migrations of herds start to overlap with farmers' fields. Any one of those can spark local skirmishes. Multiply that by hundreds of villages and dozens of city-states, and you get something that, in hindsight, looks like a generalized age of war. But not all violence is external. There's also the internal revolt model, when the biggest threat to the palace doesn't come from foreign raiders but from its own subjects. In a crisis, states often respond by squeezing harder. Tax demands go up just as harvests go down. Corvée labour, mandatory work on canals, walls, royal estates expands. Elites compete more viciously over shrinking surpluses, using the court, the priesthood, and private muscle to outmaneuver rivals. Local governors start acting like mini-kings. Peasants, soldiers, and indebted townsfolk bear the brunt. At some point, someone refuses. The evidence for this isn't usually a banner reading "Revolution" here. It's more subtle. Palaces burned while domestic quarters are left relatively intact. Administrative archives abandoned mid-use. Elite compounds looted of prestige goods, while storage jars full of grain are hauled away rather than destroyed. Later, new rulers build over the ruins but shift the layout, as if deliberately breaking with the previous regime. Written sources sometimes admit this, but carefully. Egyptian texts from the first intermediate period and later love to describe chaos. Servants killing masters, tombs robbed, fields abandoned, every man fighting his brother. Mesopotamian laments talk about cities turned to rubble, people wandering in the steppe, kings brought low. Yet these accounts are rarely neutral reportage. They're often written by later dynasties or moralizing scribes who want to dramatize how bad things got before the current glorious order was restored. Exaggerating disorder is a political tool. If you're a new king, it's useful to portray the previous era as near-apocalyptic. Only you restored mart, justice, cosmic balance. If you're a priest or philosopher, moral decline is a handy explanation for why the gods allowed disaster. So we have to read claims of all the land was in revolt or foreigners destroyed everything with caution. They may be compressing decades of intermittent troubles into one sweeping narrative of divine punishment and heroic restoration. This is where the comparative lens helps. In some places, like parts of northern Mesopotamia, the archaeological record around 2200 BC really does show violent destruction at multiple sites, followed by long abandonment. That strengthens the case that war, whether external invasion, internal revolt, or both, played a decisive, direct role in collapse there. Elsewhere, like much of the Indus world, you don't see that. No thick burn layers, no mass graves of battle casualties, no sudden spread of weapons. Cities contract, layouts change, trade patterns shift, but the process looks gradual. Whatever crises they were facing, large-scale organised war doesn't seem to be the main driver. In Egypt, you get an in-between pattern. Fortifications and local strongholds become more common. Some provincial centres show signs of conflict. Tomb scenes emphasise armed retainers and local lords boasting of defending their nomes. Yet the Great Pyramids aren't toppled by enemy armies. The Old Kingdom unravels into regional polities more through fiscal strain, political fragmentation and low Niles than through a single cataclysmic conquest. Put all this together, and a pattern emerges. Conflict tends to follow stress. Drought shrinks the pie. Trade breakdown makes neighbours less interdependent. Migration creates new fault lines. Under those conditions, raids and wars become more likely. Once fighting starts, it can feed back into the crisis. Burning fields, wrecking canals, cutting trade routes, scattering skilled labour. Violence doesn't have to start the collapse to make it much, much worse. So when we look at 2200 BC, it's misleading to ask, was it climate or war? Internal revolt or invasion? In many regions, the answer is yes. Environmental stress, economic breakdown, and political grievances created the conditions. Raids, civil wars, and uprisings were how those pressures actually played out on the ground. But there's one more invisible player that can turn local violence into region-wide catastrophe: disease, and indents early cities with failing infrastructure that may have been the deadliest hammer of all. When food runs short and people start moving, microbes get opportunities they've been waiting for. Think about what famine actually does to a population biologically. Malnutrition doesn't just make you thin, it wrecks your immune system. Protein deficiency slows the production of antibodies. Vitamin shortages cripple the cells that are supposed to kill infected tissue. Children's bodies, which should be building long-term defenses, are suddenly in triage mode just to keep basic functions going. Diseases that would normally be mild or survivable become lethal. Now add displacement. Refugees from failing farms or flooded valleys don't spread out neatly. They clump around wells, at city gates, in informal camps on the edges of irrigation channels. Crowding means shared air, shared waste, shared water. Latrines overflow. Garbage accumulates faster than anyone can move it. If the city's drainage and water systems were already under strain from low flows or neglected maintenance, this can flip them from barely adequate to actively dangerous. This is how you turn drought into epidemics without needing a single new pathogen. The problem, for the year 2200 BC, is that disease rarely leaves nice clear fingerprints in the archaeological record. Pathogens themselves are microscopic. To catch them directly, you need ancient DNA or proteins preserved in teeth, bones, or coprolites. We're starting to get that for the late Bronze Age and later plague, leprosy, tuberculosis. But for the early 3rd millennium BC, the sample size is tiny and preservation is hit or miss. Most human remains from this period haven't been screened at all, so we mostly have to look for indirect evidence. One clue would be unusual burial patterns. Sudden expansions of cemeteries, mass graves with many individuals interred at once, bodies laid out hastily or without the usual grave goods and rituals. Another is demographic structure. Lots of young adults dying in a short window, or a strange spike in child mortality that can't be explained by normal background rates. Some sites around this period do show crowded cemeteries or shifts to cheaper, simpler burials. But interpreting that is tricky. Poverty can look like plague. So can war. So can general social collapse, when people simply don't have the time or resources for elaborate funerals. Climate adds another twist. As rainfall patterns shift and rivers change course, you can get new wetlands, stagnant pools, and unstable shorelines. Those can be paradise for vectors, mosquitoes, ticks, rodents. Irrigation canals that once flowed briskly can become slow, warm, and polluted, ideal for waterborne diseases. Grazing patterns change too. Herd animals are pushed into new pastures, brought closer to cities, crowded into smaller enclosures. Every time you increase contact between humans, livestock, and wild species, you open more doors for zoonotic jumps, animal microbes trying their luck in human hosts. Did that happen around 2200 BC? It's plausible, but here we run into a boundary we shouldn't quietly erase. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, is true. We absolutely might be missing an epidemic because we just haven't dug the right cemetery or sequenced the right tooth. But we can imagine it, therefore it probably happened is not good enough. Disease is an easy ghost culprit. If we're not careful, some plague somewhere becomes a lazy way to explain any gap in our models. So how do we fit disease into the story without turning it into a magical catch-all? One approach is to treat it as an amplifier, not the original cause. Drought stresses crops and bodies, trade breakdown concentrates desperate people in fewer, poorer places. War and raids push refugees on the road. Those processes alone can explain a lot of what we see. Abandoned fields, burned cities, political fragmentation. Now add an epidemic on top of that. Suddenly labour shortages get worse. Canal maintenance stops because too many workers are sick or dead. Armies can't field full contingents. Administrations lose experienced scribes and officials. Grain reserves that might have bridged a bad year are consumed faster as the healthy feed the sick and as stockpiles rot unused. The psychological impact is brutal. When even the priests and palace households fall ill, confidence in the entire cosmic order can crack. And that leads us directly into the next part of the puzzle. Because whether or not a specific pathogen was sweeping the old world around 2200 BC, the conditions were perfect for people to feel like everything — environment, economy, politics, even the gods — was turning against them. In that kind of world, it doesn't take many failures before trust in kings, in rituals, in the very idea of a just universe starts to unravel. When that happens, you don't just have a public health crisis. You have a legitimacy crisis. And that, more than any single disaster, is what can finish off an empire. To understand why so many states stumbled around 2200 BC, you have to look at what those states were actually selling. They weren't just big dudes with spears taking your grain. They were cosmic managers. In Mesopotamia, the king wasn't ruling because he was the toughest warlord on the block. He was the shepherd chosen by the gods to keep the canals flowing, the temples fed, and the calendar of rituals ticking on schedule. In Egypt, the pharaoh was the hinge of the universe, the one whose proper rituals made the Nile rise, whose justice kept the sun god happy enough to show up every morning. In the Indus cities, where we don't see giant palaces or towering royal statues, authority may have rested more on competence and order, clean streets, standardized weights, reliable trade, predictable craft production. Different packaging. Same basic promise. Stick with us, obey the rules, and the world will stay in balance. Now imagine living inside that worldview when the balance breaks. The floods come late or not at all. Year after year the harvest comes in light. The carefully calculated ritual calendar stops lining up with what the sky and river are actually doing. Priests chant the same hymns, kings perform the same offerings, but the grain bins stay half empty. If the king's job is to guarantee prosperity by keeping the gods on side, then a string of bad years isn't just bad luck. It looks like failure at the most fundamental level. Some people will try to explain it away. Maybe the previous ruler offended the gods, and you're all still paying off the cosmic debt. Maybe a neighbouring kingdom stole a sacred statue or violated an oath, and the deities are punishing everyone until justice is done. Maybe ordinary people have become impure and need to offer more, obey more, fast more. But those excuses have a shelf life. As the crisis drags on, blame starts moving closer to the top. Scribes whisper that the king isn't as pious as his grandfather. City elites mutter that the high priest has been pocketing temple revenues instead of funding the right festivals. Governors point at each other's irrigation districts and say, their negligence angered the river spirit, not mine. A legitimacy crisis isn't an abstract thing. It shows up as finger-pointing. Scapegoats appear. Foreigners, heretics, witches, corrupt officials. Some are purged, exiled, ritually executed. New omens are read. New ceremonies invented. Sometimes it works politically. A ruler can ride that anger. Present himself as the purifier who will cleanse the land and restore favour. But the underlying problem is still there. The system that tied divine order to material prosperity has run into a world where you can perform every ritual perfectly and still get a dust storm instead of rain. At the same time, the machinery of the state is creaking under stress. Ancient bureaucracies were impressive, but they weren't nimble. Information moved at the speed of a walking messenger. Clay tablets had to be dictated, baked, filed, retrieved. Decisions travelled down a chain of command where every link could delay, distort, or skim. In good years, the system's inefficiencies were annoying but tolerable. There was enough surplus that you could lose some to corruption, spoilage, and miscommunication and still keep people mostly fed. In bad years, those same inefficiencies become lethal. A governor underreports crop failure because he doesn't want to look incompetent. A scribe alters a grain tally to protect his patron. Temple officials keep their own storehouses full while insisting the royal granary is bare. By the time news of the real situation reaches the palace, it's too late to reallocate food or reorganize labour. Bureaucracies also tend to be rule-bound. They're very good at doing what they've always done in the way they've always done it. When rainfall patterns shift or rivers abandon their beds, you need fast improvisation. New fields, new canals, new tax regimes, maybe even whole new calendars. Instead, you often get forms being filled out more frantically than ever, demanding the same quotas from farmers working failing land, the same corvée labour from households already on the edge. Eventually, local officials face a choice: obey the centre, or keep their own people alive. This is where localism surges. A provincial governor quietly stops sending troops for royal campaigns because he needs every able-bodied man to guard storehouses and patrol the canals. A city council decides to hoard its grain and lie to the capital about yields. A village headman diverts water to his fields in defiance of a regional irrigation schedule because his own children are starving now, and the king's anger is hypothetical. From the centre's point of view, that looks like rebellion. From the periphery, it feels like self-defense. Once enough local actors choose self-preservation over obedience, the state on the royal inscription starts to dissolve into a patchwork of semi-independent enclaves. Some will try to keep the old ideology alive in miniature, styling their leaders as mini-kings, performing cut-down versions of traditional rituals. Others will experiment with new forms, new alliances, new stories. And that's the other half of a legitimacy crisis. It doesn't just destroy narratives, it generates replacements. After periods of upheaval, we often see new dynasties and new theologies rewriting what just happened. Later Egyptian texts talk about the first intermediate period as a time when Ma'at, cosmic order, was overturned. Brothers fighting brothers, tombs robbed, poor people wearing fine linen, while the rich begged at their doors. Then a new line of kings presents itself as the restorers. They didn't cause the chaos, they ended it. The disruption becomes a moral lesson that justifies the new regime. In Mesopotamia, rulers after Akkad's fall liked to claim they were chosen by the gods to rebuild temples neglected by their wicked predecessors. Climate stress and political fragmentation are recast as divine punishment for earlier impiety. The new king's job is not just to tax and fight wars, but to re-stitch the relationship between heaven and earth. Sometimes the ideology shifts more subtly. Instead of a single universal monarch, authority might fragment into overlapping city gods and local cults. Instead of one story about how the world should work, you get a quilt of regional narratives, each explaining why their town survived and prospered while others fell. Notice what hasn't necessarily happened in any of this. The people themselves don't all die. Demographic collapse and political collapse are not the same thing. You can have fields still being planted, children still being born, crafts still being practiced, and yet the overarching structure that collected taxes, directed labour, organised long-distance trade, and claimed to speak for the gods can crumble or shrink to a shadow of its former self. From the ground, that might look like more local freedom or more local danger, depending on who you are. From the perspective of later historians, it shows up as broken king lists, gaps in monumental building, fewer inscriptions, abandoned palaces. It's easy to map that onto everything fell apart, even when most people simply shifted the way they were organised and who they answered to. So when we say that every empire on Earth collapsed around 2200 BC, part of what we're really talking about is this chain reaction. Environmental shocks undermine prosperity. Those failures punch holes in the stories rulers tell about why they deserve power. Bureaucracies, instead of solving the crisis, amplify it through rigidity and self-interest. Local actors peel away, and new narratives rise to explain both the disaster and the comeback. The physical droughts and dust storms mattered, but it was this invisible drought of trust, of credibility, of shared belief in the old order that turned a run of bad years into a civilizational turning point. The next question is, did this all really happen at the same time? Or are we stitching together separate regional crises into a single global drama that never actually existed? To answer that, we have to zoom in on the clock itself. If you open a textbook, it's tempting to imagine a single bad year. Dust storms over Mesopotamia, low Niles in Egypt, Indus rivers misbehaving, Levantine cities emptying out, all in one synchronized cinematic disaster, like the Bronze Age version of a global stock market crash. The reality is messier and more interesting. Start with Akkad. Most scholars put the high point of the Akkadian Empire somewhere in the 23rd century BC, under Sargon and his grandson Naram-Sin. The empire's real unravelling? That's usually dated to the late 2200s or early 2100s BC. Tablets get fewer, imperial control shrinks, rival dynasties pop up in the south. Then, by around 2150-2100 BC, the empire as a unified state is gone, replaced by regional kingdoms like Ur III. Now slide over to Egypt. The canonical date for the end of the Old Kingdom, the age of the Big Pyramids, is around 2180-2160 BC, depending on which chronology you use. After that, we're in the first intermediate period. More regional rule, fewer monumental projects, lots of debate about how collapsed things really were. Some chronologies push that transition a few decades earlier or later. None of them line up with Akkad to the exact year. Then the Indus. Here it gets trickier, because we don't have king lists or long narrative inscriptions. We have pottery styles, building layouts, radiocarbon dates. The mature urban phase of cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa seems to peak between about 2500 and 2100 BC, with gradual changes starting maybe around 2200-2100. Full-on Deurbanization, the real shrinking of cities and shift toward more rural patterns, probably stretches well into the 2000s BC. In other words, while Akkad is struggling, Indus cities are still there, still lived in, but slowly changing character, and the Levant, urban sites like Ebla, Byblos, and those along the Jordan Valley show disruptions in what archaeologists call the early Bronze Fourth period, roughly 2300 2000 BC. Some towns are abandoned, others shrink, some keep going with different architecture and burial customs. The collapse here is a drawn-out, uneven process, not a single date you can circle on the calendar. So when people say around 2200 BC, everything collapsed, what they really mean is within a loose window of maybe 200-300 years. A lot of complex systems in the old world went through major stress. Why can't we be more precise? Partly because of radiocarbon. Carbon-14 dating is powerful, but it doesn't spit out an exact year. It gives you a probability range. Then you have to run that through calibration curves, which wobble, sometimes a sample from 2250 BC. And one from 2150 BC can overlap statistically. You can usually get early 22nd century or late 23rd century. Not this happened in 2193 BC. Historical chronologies don't always save you. King lists are incomplete. Co-regencies and usurpers blur the lines. Later scribes smooth over contested transitions. Egyptologists argue over high, middle, and low chronologies that can differ by decades. Mesopotamian chronologies have their own high, middle, low debates. Try to lock a radiocarbon date from the Indus to a regnal year of Naram-Sin, and you quickly discover the ground is squishy. So what does synchronous even mean in this context? If two regions both show big changes within the same 100-year span, many climate scientists will call that synchronous. For them, the question is, was the same broad climate anomaly affecting both places? For political historians, at the same time might mean within a couple of reigns. For someone imagining a single triggering event, a comet, a volcanic eruption, a specific war, you'd need something much tighter. Same decade, maybe even the same year, that's a much higher bar, and right now the evidence doesn't clear it. The strongest case for global synchrony is the climate signal itself. Around 4.2 thousand years ago, multiple proxies, lake levels, speleothems, marine cores in different parts of the Old World show a shift toward drier, more variable conditions. In that broad sense, yes, there seems to have been a climate disruption that touched Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, and parts of South Asia within roughly the same century or two. The political collapses are wobblier. Akkad's fall lines up reasonably well with the driest part of the Mesopotamian signal. Egypt's Old Kingdom transition is in the same rough neighbourhood, but depending on the chronology you pick, it might lead or lag Mesopotamia by several decades. The Indus urban transformation stretches much longer and may begin slightly earlier or later depending on the site. The Levantine urban downturn overlaps the whole span but is patchy and gradual. Those are weak links if you're trying to argue for a single global disaster that toppled every empire on Earth in one go. But that doesn't mean the pattern is meaningless. It may just mean we need a different frame. From the ground in any one city, this was a local crisis with local causes and local politics. From 4,000 years away, when your timeline compresses and your error bars are plus or 50 years or more, what you see is a cluster, a few centuries when old systems in very different places hit their limits, under broadly similar environmental stress. Zoomed out far enough, that cluster looks like all at once. The real challenge is to ask, within that loose synchrony, how did different societies respond? Why did some bend while others broke? To get there, we have to stop looking for a single clock striking midnight moment and start thinking in terms of overlapping cascades. So let's pull back and ask the big question. If it wasn't one neat, synchronized explosion, what was it? There's one explanation that currently does the most work for most scholars, even if they argue over the details. Call it the climate-triggered cascade. In this model, the 4.2 Kiloyear event is the opening shove. Rainfall patterns change, monsoons weaken or shift. Rivers become fickle. Harvests get just a bit smaller, then a bit more unreliable. At first, it's not the end of the world, it's tighter belts, local famines, more anxious priests. But in systems already running close to the edge, that's enough. Akkad is the poster child. Reduced rainfall in northern Mesopotamia means less barley, fewer surplus grains to ship south, more dust storms, more abandoned fields. That hits tax receipts. The state can't pay soldiers or workers. Governors start freelancing. Border groups raid more because they're hungry too. The centre responds with repression and emergency campaigns that cost even more. Each move to solve one problem deepens the next. In Egypt, low Niles mean the same thing in a different key. The flood doesn't reach the high fields, grain yields drop, and suddenly a huge centralised machine built to predict the river and guarantee divine order can't. That undercuts royal legitimacy at the exact moment local officials and provincial elites control the only thing that really matters: grain storage. You don't need a civil war, you just need a few years where the king can no longer force those granaries open. Multiply that logic across trade networks. Reduced surplus at the farm means less grain for cities, fewer goods for export, less copper to import, less bronze for tools and weapons, fewer labourers fed to keep irrigation and walls in shape. Every link is stressed at once. The climate shift doesn't topple empires directly. It turns every small weakness into part of a chain reaction. That's the leading model. Climate as the first domino, political and social systems as the thing that actually shatters. But not everyone buys that framing. There's a second camp that says, turn it around. Maybe the core problem wasn't the weather. Maybe it was how these societies were built long before 2200 BC. On this reading, Akkad is an overextended conquest state, glued together by constant campaigning and heavy extraction. Egypt's Old Kingdom is a monarchy that has poured staggering resources into pyramid projects and a court culture that depends on stable flows of wealth to the centre. The Indus cities have tied themselves into intricate craft and trade systems with surprisingly little visible coercive apparatus. In that world, any moderately bad century will do. A couple of weak rulers in a row, a few internal revolts, an unlucky series of local famines, a war that cuts a trade route, and you start to see the same symptoms: provinces going their own way, monumental works slowing, urban populations thinning out. Climate in this model is more like background noise. It might make things a bit harder, but the real issue is political and economic fragility baked in from the start. Think of it as these systems were going to crack. The exact weather pattern just decided when. Then there's a third way to think about it, which is where a lot of careful work is heading now: hybrid models. Instead of one grand explanation for the 4.2 Kiloyear collapse, you get different recipes in different places. Akkad might be 70% climate-triggered agricultural crisis, 30% imperial overstretch and internal revolt. Egypt might be 40% low Niles, 60% long-term political reorganization, regional elites, and changing cult politics. The Indus might be 50% shifting rivers and monsoons, 50% a strategic choice to move away from rigid urban layouts and long-distance trade toward more flexible rural networks. Same broad environmental pulse, different local amplifiers, different outcomes. Egypt fragments but recoheres into the Middle Kingdom. Southern Mesopotamia rebrands under Ur III and keeps writing cuneiform. The Indus never rebuilds the same kind of city system again. So how do we decide which mix is right? Any convincing explanation has to clear three hurdles. First, mechanism. It's not enough to say drought or corruption. You have to spell out the chain. Less rainfall, smaller harvests, tax shortfalls, army unpaid provincial governors defect. Or rising local elites, weakened royal control, inability to coordinate famine relief. Step by step, no magic leaps. Second, timing. Your mechanism has to line up with the actual sequence of events. If your drought peak comes 150 years after the empire is already gone, it's not the cause. If your supposed civil war happens during a period the records call unusually peaceful, you have a problem. Third, evidence. Not vibes. Not just it would make sense. We're talking dated speleothems, lake cores, expurgation layers, house abandonment phases, inscriptions complaining about grain prices, skeletons showing malnutrition or violence. Direct, datable traces that match your mechanism and timing. That's where the disagreements come from. The data are patchy. We might have gorgeous climate records from one cave and almost nothing from the next valley. Some regions have hundreds of tablets or tomb inscriptions, others give us pottery sherds and layout changes and little else. On top of that, different specialists come with different toolkits. A paleoclimatologist who lives in isotope curves will happily call two events synchronous if they fall in the same 100-year band. An Egyptologist looking at regnal years wants a tighter fit, and is more cautious about letting a proxy record drive the narrative. An economist might focus on trade volumes and price signals. An archaeologist might care more about building phases and garbage pits. Same evidence, different questions, different thresholds for what counts as good enough. It's not that one side is pro-climate and the other anti-climate. It's that they weight risks differently. Overcredit the drought, and you erase human agency and politics. Undercredit it, and you end up with states mysteriously collapsing in a vacuum, as if bad luck just happened to strike 4 regions at once. So, what can we actually say responsibly in 2026? We can say that around 4.2 thousand years ago there was a real, measurable shift in climate across parts of the Old World. We can say that within a few centuries of that shift, multiple complex societies experienced major stress: political fragmentation, urban change, demographic movement. We can say that in some places, like northern Mesopotamia, the match between the climate signal and the archaeological evidence for crisis is impressively tight. In others, like parts of the Indus, it's looser, but still suggestive. We can also say that none of these collapses were purely natural disasters. Human decisions, social structures, and long-term choices about how to organize food, water, and power made the difference between bend and break. The real story lives in that interaction, a world where the environment changes and different societies, with different strengths and vulnerabilities, try to ride out the storm. In the last stretch of this video, we'll follow what happened next. Because collapse isn't an ending, it's a reset button. And what people build after everything falls apart can be even stranger than what they had before. So imagine you're living, not at the peak of these empires, but in the century after the dust starts to settle. The big monuments stop going up. The royal titulary on official seals changes. Long-distance trade caravans thin out or vanish. From the perspective of a court scribe, history has clearly taken a tragic turn. But if you zoom down to the village level, the view looks very different. Fields are still being ploughed, irrigation ditches are still being cleared, just by smaller crews under local leaders instead of imperial overseers. Potters are still throwing the same shapes their grandparents did. People are still marrying, praying, burying their dead, arguing over water rights. What we call collapse on the macro scale often looks, on the ground, like reorganization. In Mesopotamia, after Akkad falls apart, you don't get a smoking crater. You get city-states again, Lagash, Uruk, Ur rising back into prominence, each with its own kings, its own scribal schools, its own gods jockeying for top billing. Trade routes don't disappear, they bend. Instead of one empire directing everything, you have webs of small polities cutting deals, fighting little wars, finding new intermediaries. In Egypt, the first intermediate period isn't a dark age where no one remembers how to farm. Local governors, the nomes, step into the vacuum. They manage dikes, collect grain, commission tombs. Some even write autobiographies bragging that when the Nile failed, they opened their own granaries to feed the people. Royal power fragments, but administrative know-how and agricultural practice keep going. The Indus world does something even stranger. The great gridded cities decline, but the material culture, weights, bead-making styles, pottery traditions persists in smaller settlements scattered across a wider region. Urban planning loosens, the craft logic survives. Instead of dense nodes, you get a more dispersed network. In all of these regions, languages don't suddenly reset. Sumerian evolves, Akkadian keeps being written, Egyptian hieroglyphs and hieratic keep tracking legal disputes and temple offerings. Even where scripts change later, you can trace loanwords, myths, and legal formulas hopping from one regime to the next. Under constraint, people improvise. Water management schemes get smaller and more flexible. Shorter canals that a village can actually maintain without imperial corvée. Storage strategies shift from giant state granaries to more distributed household or temple stores. Political authority becomes more negotiable. Councils, city elders, coalitions of local chiefs trying to coordinate without a single god-king at the top. We also see experiments in governance that will echo for centuries. Regional confederations in Syria and the Levant, new palace centres in Anatolia that blend old and new traditions, temple networks in southern Mesopotamia that behave a lot like corporate landlords. And as all this is happening, later generations are already turning the turmoil into story. Mesopotamian scribes writing centuries after Akkad tell of Sargon and Naram-Sin, of bold kings whose arrogance angered the gods and brought ruin. Egyptian texts talk about times when the river is blood, when poor men possess riches and order is inverted. Whether or not they're literal reports, they're memories, codified as warnings about what happens when rulers fail in their cosmic duties. Even the way these stories are framed matters. They rarely say the climate changed, they say the gods withdrew favour, the king neglected justice, foreigners overran the land. The crisis becomes a moral drama, a political lesson, a charter myth for the new order that follows. That's why collapse is such a problematic word. From the vantage point of palaces, yes, systems fall apart. Monumental building slows, centralised bureaucracy shrinks. Elites lose their grip. But from the vantage point of long-term human history, collapse is more like a forced reboot. Old hierarchies crack. Marginal groups move. New trade routes are tried. Technologies and ideas that were peripheral suddenly become central. Some things vanish. The specific form of Old Kingdom kingship, the exact layout of Indus megacities, but much more quietly flows around the blockage and keeps going. Crops, craft, stories, gods, legal customs, kinship rules, they thread their way through the rubble, linking what came before to what rises after. So when we talk about the 4.2 Kiloyear collapse, we're really talking about a pulse of radical reorganisation, a bottleneck moment in which certain ways of being a state die and others are born. And that brings us back to the mystery. We still don't know exactly why that reorganisation wave hit so many regions in roughly the same era, or why some structures broke while others bent. But the aftermath makes one thing clear. Whatever happened was powerful enough to shake the old world, and yet not powerful enough to erase it. In the last part of this video, we'll sit with that tension. What does it mean that entire imperial orders can fall, their names turn to myth, and yet their fingerprints are still on us 4,000 years later? So step back from the ruins for a moment and look at the pattern we've been circling around this whole time. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, the Indus, even out into the Aegean, you get a cluster of disruptions within a few centuries of each other. Palaces shrink or vanish. Monumental projects stall. Writing systems change tone or fall silent. Long-distance trade thins, reroutes, or becomes too risky to sustain. But it's not a single synchronized explosion. Akkad frays before Egypt really tips. Some Levantine sites are abandoned early. Others hang on. Parts of Anatolia and the Aegean are changing, but not always in the same direction or on the same schedule. The Indus world is slowly reorganizing while Mesopotamian scribes are already blaming famine on angry gods. Clustered but uneven, connected but not identical. When you line the evidence up, what stands out isn't one smoking gun. It's shared vulnerabilities. All of these systems were locked into very particular ways of feeding themselves, watering fields, and moving resources. Irrigation regimes tuned to specific flood patterns. Trade routes depending on predictable winds and politically stable choke points. Tax and redistribution systems that assumed a certain minimum surplus every year. And then the background conditions started to wobble. The climate proxies, dust cores, lake levels, stalagmites, marine sediments don't all tell exactly the same story, but they rhyme. In many regions you see signs of drying, more variable rainfall or sudden swings right around that 4.2 kiloyear window, enough to shorten growing seasons, ruin harvests or make once reliable rivers fickle. On their own, those shifts might not have ended anything. Farmers had been improvising around bad years since long before there were kings. What seems more plausible is the combination: climate stress as a forcing factor, and then a chain reaction of social and political failures. Strain the harvests, and you strain tax systems. Strain taxes, and you strain armies, temple endowments, debt arrangements, royal construction projects. Suddenly promised rations don't arrive. Officials start taking more off the top. Local strongmen decide they'd rather look after their people than ship grain to a distant court. Now add in everything else that rides on that fragile surplus. Merchants who need safe roads, scribes whose livelihoods depend on a functioning bureaucracy, urban labourers who don't grow their own food. When the slack disappears, every one of those relationships becomes a potential breaking point. Under those conditions, a locust swarm, an epidemic, a civil war, a hostile migration, or an ambitious rival king doesn't have to be the sole cause. It just has to hit a system that has already lost its buffer. That's the logic of cascading failure. Drought doesn't destroy Akkad. It reduces harvests. Reduced harvests undercut revenue. Reduced revenue makes it harder to keep garrisons loyal and allies paid. That encourages rebellion and raids. Raids disrupt planting and trade even more, which deepens the famine, which undermines royal legitimacy, which erodes cooperation, which makes it harder to repair canals, and eventually you're a later scribe looking back at a vanished dynasty, writing a story about how a king offended the gods and everything fell apart. Different place, different script, same basic chain. But notice how much in that story is still guesswork. We don't have precise year-by-year timelines for every region. Our chronologies still float within decades. Shift the date of one earthquake, one royal inscription, one drought layer by 30 years, and the apparent sequence, what collapses first, what reacts to what, can change. Our climate proxies are powerful, but they're also blunt. A layer of dust in a core tells you something changed. It doesn't automatically tell you exactly how many farmers lost their crops, or how a particular city responded. New cores, better resolution, and more cross-checked records could sharpen or even overturn parts of the current picture. And then there's the human body itself. Bioarchaeology is just beginning to fill in the lived experience behind these transitions. Stable isotopes in teeth that reveal childhood diets. Stress markers on bones that hint at malnutrition or heavy labour. Ancient DNA that can show whether people moved, intermarried, or stayed put while regimes changed around them. A few dozen more well-dated skeletons from the right layers could tell us whether people in a given city were starving, fighting, migrating, or quietly adapting in place, while the official inscriptions rant about chaos. Future digs might uncover a new archive like Ebla or Mari, but set in 2200 BC instead of earlier or later, a set of letters from mayors writing to the king. The river failed again, the grain didn't come, the troops have deserted. Or, just as possible, we could find evidence that some regions we thought were collapsing were actually doing quite well, thank you by shifting their strategies under the radar of monumental architecture. So the mystery is still very much alive, but even with that uncertainty, there's a broader lesson we can carry forward without pretending to have all the answers. Complex systems rarely fail because of one thing. They fail in chains. A small number of bad harvests matters more when your political order has no graceful way to shrink. A single border conflict matters more when your trade network has no easy alternative routes. A legitimacy crisis matters more when your ideology doesn't allow kings to say, "We miscalculated," only the gods have turned against us. When everything is tightly coupled, food, water, trade, prestige, belief, pressure in one place, transmits everywhere. The old world at 2200 BC wasn't wiped clean. People endured, adapted, and repurposed the wreckage. But the way those early states were built made them particularly bad at bending. So when the strain came, many of them broke. Which explanation do you find most convincing? A climate-driven shock that knocked over one pillar after another? Internal inequality and brittle politics waiting for any excuse? Disease and migration playing a bigger role than we've given them credit for? Or something else entirely that we just haven't found yet? I'd love to hear your take. Drop a comment with the model that makes the most sense to you, and why. And while you're down there, tell me where you're listening from. One of the coolest things about making these deep dives into ancient history is seeing people from all over the modern world comparing notes in the comments. If you found this video useful or thought-provoking, please take a second to like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. That simple click genuinely helps more people see this kind of long-form, evidence-driven content. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description. Streaming the episodes there helps the show grow and tells the algorithms that people care about this kind of slow, careful look at the past. Because in the end, the 4.2 Kiloyear event isn't just a puzzle about dead kings and broken canals. It's a rehearsal. It's an early case study in what happens when human systems outrun their margins, when we build intricate, beautiful, fragile networks on top of environmental assumptions that don't hold forever. We're not Akkad. We're not the Old Kingdom. Our technologies and lifeways are wildly different, but the basic physics of complexity haven't changed. We still live in tightly coupled systems. We still depend on stable climate bands, reliable trade, political narratives that claim to make sense of it all. And we're still surprisingly bad at imagining how those things fail, not in one apocalyptic moment, but in a series of linked, unglamorous stresses that accumulate until someone, centuries later, looks back and calls it a collapse. Maybe that's why this mystery matters. Not because we can use it to draw neat one-to-one predictions, but because it forces us to see how fragile normal can be, and how much creativity people can still show when normal falls apart. 4,000 years ago, a wave of reorganization rolled through the old world. Some systems shattered, others flexed, virtually all of them left traces in the languages, laws, stories, and institutions we live with today. We're still living in the wake of that bottleneck, and somewhere in a future layer of sediment, our choices, what we stabilize, what we let break, how we respond when the background conditions start to wobble, will be just as visible as their canals and dust storms are to us. Thanks for listening.